Meeting for Tuesday, April 17th, 2018. As always, we are disclosing this meeting is video recorded. So any comments you make will be recorded for YouTube posterity and the Medfield TV website. Before we begin, we will take a moment of appreciation for our troops serving in the Middle East and around the world. Thank you. It looks like we did not have any sign-in for citizen comment as yet, so we'll proceed to our first appointment, which is further review of the LIP application for 41 Dale Street, presented by John Kelly and Dan Winslow. This is the second Board of Selectmen meeting we're having on this project, which followed on 4 Affordable Housing Trust Board meetings as well. So I'm not going to make any predictions whether this is the last Board of Selectmen meeting on this project or maybe the second. So I don't know if you have a presentation planned, John or Dan, or anything you'd like to say to start.
There was no presentation on the back of last week. The only addition was, I think, the sole comment.
Microphone?
Sorry, oh.
If you get to the microphone over there,
That
please.
just allows the people at home to hear you, John.
We have no additional presentation planned on the back of what was done last week. The only addition was on the back, I think, of Mike Sullivan's comments on the sewer and water. And so Ron Tiberi confirmed that there's a deep well at the junction of Frary and Dale. And so for the water and sewer, we'll be tying into that. I'm not too sure if it's gravity or force fed, but it'll be tying into there. Ron talked to him during the initial application, and there was no concerns over capacity. So we haven't updated it, but I think at this reduced level, I imagine it shouldn't be an issue with the capacity there.
Okay. All right. So if that's all you have to add, why don't we start with Pete? If you have any questions or comments or anything else you'd like to share with respect to the project.
Nothing at this point.
I guess my only question, have you received any more comments from the public or anyone since we had our last meeting here?
There's been no additional comments. So all the public comments have come from the various MRA meetings, the Allendale residence meetings, the Affordable Housing Trust meetings.
Okay.
Okay.
I had one comment from a neighbor who opposed it. Nancy Sullivan, I think it was.
All right. Does anyone in the audience have any questions or comments before we move to final discussion and vote on this?
Could I ask, when do we get? Kathy Belmont, 40 Frary Street. When do we get to ask questions about things that are going to affect the neighborhoods, such as the lighting? I might be premature on asking this. Lighting, construction, what would be the length of time that you'd be planning the construction to be ongoing? Where are those vehicles going to enter and exit? Where will they park during the day? Probably on the lot, but those kinds of things. Is it appropriate to ask those ahead of time, or do we have to wait until the project is begun? What?
Why don't I ask Sarah Repose of the town plan? I believe it's part of the ZBA process and following on the ZBA process, but
Sarah Repose, the town planner. Yes, exactly. It's part of the ZBA process. Initially, it's concept plans, and even what's required isn't as fully detailed as what ends up getting submitted to us. And so we'll ask for a construction management plan as part of that process as well.
Are there any other questions? So just from a timing standpoint, just where we are, we've with all of the developers who propose LIP projects, we enter into an agreement with them, kind of setting out their obligations to the town's obligations as part of the process, and a little bit of the schedule. And so just what we've negotiated so far, I've got a few additional comments that we can work out, and we'll adopt it in the future, is that the comprehensive permit would be expected to be issued if it's successful in May of 2019. And so construction would not begin until later in 2019, just from a timing standpoint, as it has to go through the ZBA.
So we're dictating the timing that we want the project to come in at,
correct,
revolving around our safe harbor needs.
That is correct. So the idea would be it would be submitted for safe harbor certification from May of 2019 to May of 2020, because we have 2 projects in the works to be submitted for this year. So, anything else? Any other discussion, comment?
I don't know.
Okay. We'll start with, we have a motion.
I would like to move that we approve the Medfield Green project as proposed.
And subject to negotiation of a satisfactory MOU.
Subject to negotiation of satisfactory MOU. I'm still new in this particular position here.
I'll second that.
Okay, all in favor?
Yep.
Aye.
All right, and I want to say, kind of having been through this process throughout, and we'll work on the agreement that, you know, I appreciate the work that Mr. Kelly and Mr. Winslow have done. I appreciate the work that all the neighbors have done. I realize this is not a satisfactory result for everybody, and there's obviously further approvals that are necessary. I do think that after a very painful start to the process, that people on both sides of this did a good job in trying to make something work successfully for the town. I know for me, as that we went through this process, ultimately, you kind of picked the size of the project that made it a difficult decision. I think if it were a 24-unit project, it would be an easy yes. If it were 48, it'd be an easy no. And 36 was right where we had to think about it a lot. And so I was a skeptic throughout a lot of this. And I think overall, on balance for the town, this is overall in the best interest of the town, given where we are with other potential projects and in our desire to move at a measured pace towards the 10% under 40B, and kind of where things stand otherwise. I think this puts us in a solid position to continue to control our own destiny. I do appreciate this will have an impact on the particular neighborhood, and I respect the fact that this is not necessarily met with huzzas and all of that, but I do respect the way everybody on both sides of this handled this process. I think it has been a credit to Medfield throughout in this process, and I think the way it has gone with Emra and the neighbors and the folks in Allendale has continued to be a credit to Medfield. And so I'm always proud to be from this town, but I think this project, particularly given where we started, I think it's ended up in a pretty good place for the town, and I hope that when we look back on this many years hence, we'll see this as a successful result for the town, and I hope that Mr. Kelly, and trust that he will follow through on his commitment to make this a successful project for the town. So thank you to everybody, and we'll get you the revisions we have to this. I hope that they won't be controversial, and we can adopt it at a future meeting. You won't necessarily have to come back with any pictures or anything else at that time. So, anything else on this? All right. So, our ALS committee.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the words. Look forward to it.
So, the ALS committee update is on for 7:30, so we can't start that for another 17 minutes by my read of that clock. So we can move on to some of the additional items. I see Mike is not here yet. Mark, do you have,
A couple minutes past,
I think that's the official clock, right?
about 3 minutes past. Do I have one?
Are you questioning?
20 minutes, 20 minutes.
No, I'm just letting you know if you're using that to go by, it's not accurate.
Okay. We won't use it for a shuttle launch or anything, but I think for purposes of meeting, we could probably say that when it's 7:30 on that clock, it'll be 7:30. Is that all right? I wanted to, informational, if we could tick off some of these items until we get to 7:30. Do you know anything about this memo from Mogulay about the DEP protection order on the wastewater treatment enforcement conference?
There.
Is Mike going to talk about that?
I think Mike is prepared to talk about it.
I have a general understanding that,
This one.
there was a meeting between DPW and, I'm not sure, I guess a consultant and DEP over issues related to the plant. They met, I think, last week. I don't know what more specific information. I have some general idea. I don't want to repeat it because I'm not that sure of it, but Mike may have.
Why don't we
more
wait until Mike gets here and we can go talk through it with Mike. All right, consent agenda. Just repeat, any comments or objections to anything on the consent agenda?
What is on the consent agenda? Just the,
Well, we added, it's all in red, the additional
Yeah.
items.
hold on a minute.
All right.
Ready if you are, Pete.
I'm fine with it.
Okay. I move that we approve the 3 items on the consent agenda as described.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Yep.
All right. All right. are we ready to sign the 2018 annual town meeting warrant?
I'm ready to have you vote to sign the warrant,
Okay,
and I will call you as soon as the warrant has been delivered for you to sign.
okay. All right, is there any, do we need any discussion before we vote to sign the warrant?
Is there anything we need to talk about before we sign the warrant?
All right.
It's the exact same warrant we've been talking about for quite a long time now.
In case,
You don't have better news for us than that? Okay.
Yeah, let's get a new one.
in that case, I move that the selectmen approve signing the town warrant.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Yep.
So our two other pending items here probably are both going to take a while. Gus or Pete, do you have a preference as to which one we take up first as between the discussion of financial policies and Medfield State Hospital? I mean, I think there's probably a better chance the financial policies can be done in the 16 to 19 minutes that we have before
Yeah,
7:30.
either, I'm happy either way.
You
Either
don't
way
think
is
so?
fine.
I'm gonna be
He meant,
optimistic.
he meant better than the chances of the state hospital conversation.
By that measure. All right, so let's do that. And I'm assuming that what was, I didn't get copies of the stuff that was put in front of us, but I'm assuming it's the same comments that you had. Or you have new comments today.
No, I didn't have, no, I don't have anything new. If you think that's what these are, I'm glad to hear that, because, again, we don't have the one with the comments.
This one, I have this one.
Yeah, that was the one I handed out last week.
You have
so.
this one, Pete?
Yes. Yep.
All right, so why don't we start on this,
I have that one.
since we hopefully have the right one. And if I can read my notes. Do you have this version that Gus handed out with the bubble comments
I
on
do.
it?
If the comments are in the right hand, so that was, for some reason, every time we sent this out, the comments got lost, so the copy of this that got sent out, that I handed out last week, has the comments in the column. The hard copies here, for some reason, reject my comments.
The right one?
Nope.
You know what?
That's all.
Why
This
don't-
is excellent TV, by the way, if people are watching at home. Try to get the right copy of this markup.
Yeah, why don't you hand that to Pete?
Okay.
And then, this will be a test of my short-term memory, if I can remember what I said last week when I entered all the comments. So.
No, still old. Thanks, guys.
Yep.
So Pete, why don't we start, if you have comments?
Well, my main issue was the, at the end where it says that we shall maintain 2.5% free cash. And I just wondered whether we wanted to make that mandatory, because there could be some times where we want to dig into our reserve fund. I mean, I think of it as a goal, but if we actually can't touch the money, that concerns me.
So Pete, what I did on that one is I said that we shall maintain that free cash balance in our proposed budget for the same thought, is that if over the course of a year, we have something that causes us to have to drop free cash below that, we do that, but we don't, so it kind of kept the shell in terms of keeping the stake in the ground for the budget, but it doesn't mandate that we can't use that money and go below the 2.5 in terms of how
okay,
we
all right.
actually spend it.
Yep. Then I'm good with that.
I was okay with that too, I thought that was a good change. So it doesn't really apply mid-year.
Right. It's kind of like the snow budget. You have to pay for it the next year.
Pay for the snow
Yeah.
budget.
That was my big issue.
So I don't have any big issues, so I just have a couple thoughts. So on the first comment, should the capital budget committee maintain a prioritized list of proposed capital investments? And so I guess my question is, do you mean beyond the 5 years?
Well, you have there's a 5-year plan and a 20-year, so I like the idea of those two being separate. The reason I suggested that is if we have an established prioritized list and someone has a need for something that they think needs to bump up in the priority, then you have this agenda there that says, this is what we're planning to do, so you know you have to, got it? Okay. It was, I think all my comments were intended to make this better. It wasn't a fundamental philosophical issue, but what I was thinking is, that way everybody knows what the prioritized list is. If somebody thinks they have a pressing need that ought to be bumped up, that gives them the forum
Okay.
to do that against. But
So you'd
that
sort
was
of
why.
have the 5 years, which would be, okay, this is the stuff for the next 5 years, and to the side, you'd have, here's the additional ones for after that.
Yeah.
Makes sense to me.
Well, yeah, and even the 5-year is gonna have a sequencing.
Right, right.
So what I'm getting is if somebody comes in and says, gee, I need something in 4 years and I didn't know it,
Right.
you have a place to measure against, yeah.
All right, that's fine. Let's see. So, on the chapter 90 and the water and sewer, I don't think we have a philosophical disagreement on this. I guess I have an objection to the notion, I don't think this is what you intend, that there's sort of funds that are within the control of a particular department and that aren't kind of part of the town's overall planning. And so, as the chapter 90 funds, for example, the department may have particular priorities for them. It may be, in some instances, that it would be easier for the department to spend it on equipment that would make the life easier. In the town's priorities, it may be a preference that we spend it on more roads, road repaving. And so I think the intention is not to cut the department out of it, but to make that discussion part of the overall.
That's exactly, yeah,
prioritization.
yeah, yeah.
And the same thing with water and sewer. I think 9 times out of 10, everybody's just gonna agree with what the water and sewer board
Right,
recommends.
right.
But just given the impact on ratepayers for the most part, the same people.
That comment was purely about not leading to confusion over who's
Right.
actually responsible for figuring out the best way to
Right.
handle those funds, but,
Right.
yeah.
So in other words, just like they do now, both the highway department and the water and sewer would sort of put their projects into the budget.
Right.
With funding attached to them.
Right,
frequently.
right.
But there might be some rejiggering, more on the highway side.
Right.
Than on the, okay, that's fine. So on your comment about the DPW director and the vehicles, I think the thought here was, because I thought it was a good revision the last time, in terms of getting confirmation from the maintaining department.
Yep,
doing
yep.
the thing. Since the DPW is now gonna be the maintaining department for our vehicles, and under the fleet management software, I think the idea is long-term, Christine, correct me if I'm wrong, that DPW will sort of be maintaining all of the vehicles in town.
Correct.
And so, under the software they have, will sort of be mapping out when those vehicles need to be replaced. And so this was more thought of if,
So just to test that, so the fire department will have to go to the DPW to get approval of a new ladder truck. The police will go to the DPW to get approval of new police cruisers?
No.
so from my perspective, it's more if you need a new police cruiser and based on the personnel we have in DPW, we can maintain one and not the other, we should get the one we can maintain internally versus the one we can't maintain. But if ultimately, Richie says, look, I need this more so, and it's worth the money to maintain it outside, capital budget committee, everyone else can say, okay, you know what, we're gonna get that car anyway, even though we can't maintain it. It's mostly to say, if we're gonna be maintaining the vehicles centrally, to try to maintain them centrally as best we can. And at least have a check on any department that wants a new car, maybe the mechanic says, you know what, I don't think we need a new car.
Okay, so the new information for me here is I didn't know about the decision to centralize all vehicle maintenance with the DPW, so
That's why, that last year, that's why we hired a second mechanic to come on and start managing the fleet management software. So that the school department, instead of paying an outside contractor or vendor to do oil changes and that kind of thing, will start to come in-house at the DPW.
Okay.
Yeah, so that'll be a good reason to have them run it by, so that if there's any kind of standardization that would save on maintenance and parts supply and whatnot, it would make sense to at least run it by them. I don't think that they're not intending to do things like fire trucks and
No, none of the large fire trucks, obviously.
smaller vehicles.
the
They
small
will still
vehicles
send
that
the
we can
large
maintain.
ones out,
Okay.
so.
So who maintains the fire trucks then, Mike?
And there's specialized companies,
Specialized,
that's what they do.
Oh, okay.
The pumps, all the other stuff besides the
Yeah,
automotives.
complicated, huh?
They do a big one, sometimes they have to send them out to Wisconsin to be worked on. That's where they were made. They take a standard truck and then customize it for a fire truck. They used to be around here, there used to be a couple of companies in Massachusetts, but they all closed down.
Maxim.
Yeah, Madison, there's a couple of others, but they've
So
all.
how do you get it to Wisconsin? You drive it out there?
Yeah.
Okay. So if there's anyone in the room who has any reason to think that this transfer of responsibility should not be given to the DPWs, speak now or forever hold your peace.
Mo's not here, unfortunately.
It was his idea.
I'm willing to, I mean, certainly if it doesn't work, we'll find out about it, but it was just news. I wasn't aware of that decision, so that's fine. Okay. Pull that one back.
Might have been before you were.
Might have been.
I don't remember when you first, I know this was one of the things.
I think we've talked, it might have been, we might have put it in place, hired the mechanic last year, we talked about it 2 years prior,
I
it might have been
think
2
we
years
talked about it
ago.
when we interviewed him.
Yeah,
I
I
seem to
think
remember
He's been here
when
2 years,
we
so.
interviewed Mo, like, one of the
when
things
Mo
he said
came
he
in to
did.
talk about his pavement management program, he also talked about his fleet. In fact, did we use part of the money we got from the Commonwealth grant to fund the fleet management?
Town meeting funded the fleet management through the capital plan, yeah.
Okay.
I think that was at least last year, if not 2 years ago.
I think it was 2 years ago.
So I would join with Gus in saying that I don't remember this being the plan, that the DPW was going to maintain the fleet for the town, but I think it's a good idea.
Either it was a long time ago, Pete, or we both have a short-term
Right.
memory issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or
Okay.
Mo has made a naked proposal to take charge of all the
Okay,
vehicles
no,
in town.
I withdraw that comment.
And then comment 7 on the IT, I couldn't tell if this was something that would go in this policy or this is another thing.
This, I think it goes in the policy. Here's the issue as I see it. We talk about capital assets in terms of hard assets, but in today's world, information systems are capital assets. We had Ian come in, ask for, I think, $175,000 increase in his staffing this year because he truly needs it. But the reason he truly needs it is we have departments that are introducing new information systems that are bringing in significant technology support requirements, and the town is not out in front of that decision that has those downstream implications. So for me, even though this is an information system and not a capital, like a building or a vehicle or a piece of equipment, the town needs to be out in front of the long-term maintenance costs of doing that, and it is in fact a capital investment. So the real question I was raising there is, what will the control be? In the way this was initially worded, it almost sounded like maybe it's the IT department, but I don't actually really think that's necessarily the right answer for the IT department that provides support for information systems to be the ones making the strategic decisions around IT. But I think that's a question we're not out in front of that issue right now.
I don't think the staffing was 175,000, it might have been some other parts.
Yeah. It was an $85,000 staffing increase.
What was the rest?
It wasn't a $175,000 increase.
It might have been software packages or something, or
So it's not all, it wasn't all staffing. My point is, there's a.
Yeah, it
there's a
wasn't one, I can pull it out.
technology
It's not
support cost that
175.
just showed up. And it might, and as stated, if it was, because I think it was only one, in fairness, I think it was only one additional staff member. Right?
Yeah, that's why I was
So
wondering,
that's
I said,
fine.
I hope we're not paying them
I think the increase in the-
175,000.
I'm gonna apply for it.
Yeah, I think the increase in the budget was $175,000, and that was driven by increased technology support.
I can pull it out. I don't have it in front of me.
We may have to have the income in and defend his budget again if it's not that, but.
At least this one was 109,000 increase. And so larger than salaries, and the salaries. were-
85,000 was the salary increase, and the rest was the increase in maintenance contracts.
So the point's the same either way.
Yes.
Right.
Is
Yeah.
that that's just something we need to be out in front of.
And so I guess the question I have then is do we treat it differently than other capital assets in the process? Right, so we kind of traditionally, departments have kind of identified capital assets that they wanted to add or upgrade or maintain, and then it's gone through kind of the capital budgeting process, you know, the capital budget committee, then to warrant committee, selectmen, I mean, all that. And so, I mean, this is really a question I don't have a view on, is do we need a different process than that for IT?
Well, I think the process that needs to be different is the actual capital budgeting process. And that had to do with my comments about picking things up as actual parts of the capital inventory that the town is taking responsibility for. And the easy poster child for this is the turf field that We were really glad we got the turf field because it was donated to start with, but then 10 years later, there's $1 million cost. And we never actually had that discussion that said, yes, we think every 10 years, or I think it's gonna last longer now, but every 10 years, we're gonna kick in another $1 million, and here's where it's coming from. So the whole intent around this is, if departments are gonna go and acquire capital assets, it's not enough simply to propose the cost of the capital asset. You need to also project the life cycle cost to maintain it, and then that becomes part of that long-term planning on the part of the capital budgeting committee to say, yes, we're picking this responsibility up. That would tie into the finance, the funding, the stabilization fund. There ought to be integrity in that whole thing that ties that together. I bet you when we start off, we're gonna have people make mistakes and they're gonna underestimate their long-term costs. That's fine. The point is to get that kind of a process in place, and you'll learn over time how to truly capture those true life cycle costs. So for me, yeah, the IT is the same as that, in the sense that if you need to project your downstream support costs, and you need to say what they are when you're getting approval of the system. If you don't do that, then the department basically has to figure out a way to bite the bullet and cover it.
Okay. But we don't need to create another committee or process
I
behind
hope
this.
not.
Okay,
No.
good. Well, with that, it looks like it's at least 7:30, if not later.
We
So
got to page 2.
we got to page
It's
2.
actually a short document.
I'd like to think we got through comment 7. Look at it, and
That's fair.
there's less, I have less than the rest, so
Okay.
we'll move on to that later. But let's get on to the ALS committee update. I've assumed that we'll start, Gus, with you for the committee, and then Steve.
That okay with you, Steve? I'll go
for
first,
you.
then you're up
Gus
next?
will go first, then you.
I'll go first. What I have here, I brought 6 copies of this. This is an excerpt for the folks in the audience. There's a public information session scheduled for 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon at the center that was probably going to be a little less formal than the second public information session scheduled for Wednesday night, April 25th at the Public Safety Building. So if you want more details on these things, you can get those there. What I'm handing out here is an excerpt of 8 slides. You've already heard the recommendation from the committee on what the recommendation is. Basically, right now, we have 8 full-time members of the firefighting staff. 2 of those firefighters are paramedics, 6 of them are EMTs. One of those EMTs is an intermediate, so he's kind of halfway up toward being a paramedic. In order to acquire or to get licensed to provide ALS support for the town, we need to be able to staff our shifts with 2 paramedics. That's a unique requirement of this particular region in Massachusetts. So if we lived somewhere else, that wouldn't be a requirement. But basically here, the standard is to have 2 paramedics available for calls. They wouldn't necessarily always be on every call, but in order to be staffed, to be ALS licensed, you have to do that. So the plan, the recommended course of action is to hire 4 additional paramedics. So we would go from a staff of 8 full-time firefighters to 12. That's a 50% increase. That increase is not a capacity increase. That is a quality of service increase to go from basic life support to advanced life support. We have 6 EMTs. We're only need to keep 4, which means we're looking for 2 EMTs to be converted into paramedics, so we can acquire a total of 8 paramedics. But the way we get there is hire 4 new ones. We already have 2, and we swap out 2 EMTs over time to get the 7th and 8th paramedic. So that's the staffing plan. When you try to get an ALS license for your town, you're allowed to operate at the ALS level if you have established support procedures with neighboring towns. Before you can actually operate at an ALS level before you're fully staffed at the ALS level, because the state recognizes it takes a while to actually build up the staff to meet that full 8 paramedic requirement. So what we'll be doing is, during the time that we're making that transition, we'll be looking to swap out 2 of the EMTs and have them either become paramedics if they choose to get a paramedic qualification, or if they choose to leave, replace them with a paramedic. Right now, one of the EMTs will hit a mandatory retirement age within this window, so we expect that will be an easy one. There's a possibility that the one extra EMT doesn't want to leave for a number of years, at which time we could wind up with an extra EMT. As the chair of the ALS study committee, trying to read between the lines and sense the wind and get a sense of the overall intent and interest of our current staff, I believe it's reasonable to be optimistic that we will be able to swap out at least one more EMT who would want to become a paramedic. Nobody signed on the bottom line. I don't have a name, but I've gotten enough reinforcement from people that are closer than I am to the department to where I don't think the risk of us getting stuck with an extra EMT is particularly concerning. If it does happen, it would sound like that's an issue that would arise 5 to 6 years from now, and certainly not sooner than 3 years from now, because we get a 3-year waiver, and it sounds like it's pretty easy to get another 3-year waiver. So that's the risk side of it. There are some operational reasons why it's useful to go from a shift of 2 permanent firefighters to 3. It gives you a certain degree of flexibility around being able to man the fire station if 2 people still go out, so that's one piece of it. Another piece of it is from a firefighting standpoint, having more than 2 people at the scene of a fire. I think it's actually required that there be more than 2 people at the scene of a fire. So there's an advantage from an operational standpoint. In all fairness, if it was only an issue of improving the operational effectiveness of our firefighting capabilities, we would not be having a conversation about hiring 4 more firefighters. But the combined advantage of being able to provide the ALS service, having greater capabilities to actually fight fires, having more flexibility around the actual staffing and the response from the fire station, all combines to make that be an advantage. The paramedic cost, the model that we did, and this was the most comprehensive labor cost model you've seen so far from any committee. There are 3 components to the labor cost. The first one is the cost of these paramedics to the fire department budget itself. So that's the cost you'll see in the salary line of the fire department budget. The model that we had a cost there of $81,377. That's using current rates in the current fire contract. So it didn't escalate anything for out years, and it didn't speculate on what those rates might be because we're in the middle of a contract negotiation with the fire department. So basically, we're estimating that right in line with what the rates currently are. That's about $82,000. There's another piece, which is the townwide budget, which are the budgets that cover the town employees' health care, retirement, workers' comp. Those things don't show up on the budget. They show up on the townwide budget. And this year in particular, those townwide budgets grew about $700,000. So we don't get to control those. They're just a function of what health care and pension and things like that turn out to be. It's not a small thing.
7 million. You say 700,000.
No, 700,000 cost of the budget, the actual, it's not 7 million on the budget.
Oh, I thought you meant health insurance.
No, I meant the growth. I meant this year, those combined budgets grew 700. I don't think they grew quite $750,000, but they grew over 700,000. So that's a big problem this year for town meeting. The cost on that for one firefighter, assuming what we did on healthcare, it makes a big difference whether new hires choose family health care or if they're married, or if they don't choose health care or if they choose single health care. We carried the cost as $8,000, which is 50% of the full family cost around $16,000. So all of that combined was another $11,000 that goes onto the town budgets. Normally, when you hear about new hires, you don't hear that number at all. And then finally, there's the OPEB, the other post-employee benefits, which are primarily retiree health care and pension costs. Those don't have a budget. Those are just long-term financial obligations that the town is working to get out in front of. So when you see the OPEB article, that's trying to get money to throw onto that so that we can continue to follow through on the commitments the town has to retirees to provide them with health care and other post-employment benefits. All that together comes out to $97,234. So just think of it as $100,000. There's 4 paramedics, so the cost to the town across all this stuff, including the OPEB, is $400,000, of which $380,000 actually hits the budgets. And out of that, think of it as $320,000 hits the fire department budget, and $80,000 hits the townwide budgets. Just, I'm rounding, but it's easier to remember the numbers. When we took a look, and we had the good services of a volunteer who used to be here in town, but who lives in Rentham and is the COO for Falk Ambulance Service, Brendan McNiff, who understands the economic models of private ambulance services and of ambulance operations. He took an in-depth look at our operation, and he modeled what would happen if we were able to be ALS licensed. When he looked at some of our dispatch procedures, he found a way that we could actually generate $50,000 more in revenues if we were ALS licensed and if we dispatched in accordance with what the state allows if you're ALS licensed. He recognized that the actual fees, when we get mutual aid from Westwood, Walpole, or Norfolk, when they do that, we pay them fees. Those fees are on the order of $85,000 that goes out to those towns because we don't have ALS and they're providing us with ALS service. So if we had ALS service, we would bring those fees back in. So that's another $85,000. And then we conservatively estimated that Dover and Sherborne that don't have ALS would rely on us more heavily and that we would generate another $25,000 in revenues coming from Dover and Sherborne because we're close and we're friends with them. That comes out to about $160,000. We modeled it as $150,000. So $400,000 in increased cost, including the OPEB, $150,000 in increased revenues, nets out to an increased cost to the town of $250,000. That's, a year ago, we were talking about $600,000 to be able to get ALS. We had an article that was voted down to give us $500,000 to hire a private ambulance service, and the committee was formed to try to come up with the best option it could for how Medfield could acquire ALS. I'm satisfied this committee has come up with the best option it can, and the price tag for that's $250,000. So there will be an article for the ALS support of $250,000 this year as an operating override.
Thank you. Before we get to questions from Pete and I, and then from anyone here who has questions, would you mind just going over sort of what the committee did? Committee composition, kind of a little, not day by day, detail by detail, but just sort of an overview of the process that's gone on over the course of the past year.
So the committee composition will be, see, I almost brought my whole thing with me, and I said, no, I just need this extract, it doesn't have it. And I thought about, should I bring the committee chart? And I didn't. So for those who, if you ever serve on a town committee, if you're the dumbest one on the committee, you can rest assured you'll be elected chairman. So I'm the chairman of the ALS Study Committee. Christine Trierweiler is also a member of the committee. Now, we started off with 10 people on the committee, 7 of whom were voting members, 3 of whom were not. Originally, the committee was supposed to be 7 people strong. We got such solid resumes coming in from people who were willing to serve on this committee that we expanded the committee. So we have Chad Boylan, who's a lieutenant in the Framingham Fire Department, but who lives here in town, is on the committee. Steve Caskey is a member of the committee, and I usually describe Steve, like me, as somebody whose main qualifications is we come in with a hard-nosed view toward what we spend, but that's, he may choose to describe himself a different way, but neither one of us are firefighters, I guess would be the way I would put it. Neil O'Connor is on the committee as a voting, Steve is a voting member, I'm a voting member, Neil is a voting member, Chad is a voting member. Neil's a former paramedic, now works as a contractor here in town. I've known him from Boy Scouts is when Neil and I first ran across, but he has experience in the area, understands private ambulance services, understands fire operations, and just volunteered to help out with this committee. Tom Marie was on the committee as a voting member, as the representative of the warrant committee, but about a month and a half ago, Tom stepped down because, A, he's on the warrant committee, and so he's fighting the budget battles. He was on the ALS study committee, and he was also on the bargaining committee for the for the fire department contract. So that kind of made it a little difficult for him to figure out how he could avoid all conflicts of interest when he was in a triangular fix. So he stepped down, but he has been a member of the committee, was a voting member. Jeff Bonatti, lieutenant on the Medfield Fire Department, was not a voting member because he was a lieutenant on the Medfield Fire Department, but he's a member of the committee. And let's see, who did I leave out? Holly Rand. Holly Rand. Yes, thank you. Holly Rand's a physician assistant. Is a voting member on the committee. She actually teaches ACLS, the Advanced Cardiac Life Support. When she first came to a Selectmen's meeting before we ever formed the committee, one of the things that caught my attention about her is she had some very good points to be made about the importance of maintaining the skills of paramedics. So that's the basic. Have I left anybody else out? Was that, I didn't.
Chief Meany.
Well, no, Chief Meany, yeah, and Chief Meany is a voting member. So that's the committee. I didn't count, so I was, feels a little shy, but okay, Chief Meany. And there are two people in the back here, Chief Hollingshead, who was not a member of the committee, but as the acting fire chief has been a tremendous resource for us and has been showing up, and Sean Kay, who attempted to be a member of this committee, and just probably unjustifiably didn't make the cut, to be honest with you, now that I've looked and I know him better. But Sean, despite not actually being selected for the committee, has come to a lot of the meetings, has offered his insights, has been tremendously helpful to us, helped us get on the path that we wound up on in October, that let us get ready for April. And I would just hold Sean up. If you do volunteer for a committee and you don't get selected, they're public meetings. It doesn't mean you can't come. And sometimes you don't get selected because the people making the decisions just don't fully understand what you can contribute. It's got nothing to do with you. So please come if you're so motivated on things like that. We have the charter asks us to look at a number of different things. First, the main point was to figure out a way to get ALS for Medfield. What would be the best way for us to go about acquiring an ALS capability here in Medfield? We were asked to explore all the options that we possibly could, and we were even asked to think about the trends in emergency care and what those implications might be on what we would want to do from a long-term standpoint. From the standpoint of looking at options, if you step back and just started from scratch, there's a good chance that the best theoretical option is to regionalize ALS services in order to provide, resources everywhere. The problem is the process that's gotten us to where we're at right now is a process where each town has had to make a decision, and at the time they were ready to make a decision, the other towns weren't. So Westwood, Walpole, Norfolk, they all decided to acquire their own ALS capability. And when they did that, the intercept service that had been operating out of the hospital, Norwood Hospital, suddenly didn't have enough demand to support them continuing on as a business, and they went away. And I've slightly oversimplified the story, but basically what happened is historically we were supported by a private ambulance service sponsored by a local hospital, and at some point it wasn't worth it anymore. So they went away. Well, so then years ago, Millis started to look at this, and I think originally they had some discussions with Medfield about, do you want to regionalize? And my understanding is we weren't ready to do it. So Millis wound up doing it going off on their own. And that's, right now, we're in the same boat. We went and we checked with Dover and Sherborne to say, do you want to regionalize? Now, they're looking, saying, we really don't need to, because we're okay. We get supported by our surrounding towns. Our call volume is so low. We would rather just pay the ambulance fee whenever we need it, and nobody's giving us the hard time they're giving you. Their volume is half of, each of those towns, their volume is half of ours, and Sherborne is next to Framingham, and Dover is close to Wellesley. So where Westwood and Walpole are the big towns, you can see how even bigger towns are supporting them, and they don't really care. So at a tactical level, it makes sense that they don't want to have anything to do with us. But now they're the only ones that are left without the ALS if we were to move ahead with ALS capability. And that's how we got to where we got. we have round numbers, we have 500 calls, and it costs us money to do this. If we had 3,000 calls, we could find a private ambulance service that would do it at no cost. It's just we don't have the volume.
Thank you, Gus. We'll start with some questions, just procedurally here. To the extent Pete has any questions, we'll take questions from Pete and I. We'll take questions probably for a few minutes from folks who are here, and then we'll hear from Mr. Caskey, and there'll be additional time for questions and discussion at that point.
I should say that the committee, when it voted on its recommendation, 4 committee members voted in favor of this option, and 2 voted for an alternative, which you'll also see tonight.
So Gus, my first question is the $100,000 per year cost for the paramedic, that has a $15,000 overtime factor in there. Is that likely to continue when we have these extra 4 people in the fire department?
I think probably that's a good question to ask the new fire chief, but what we did do is, if I had to speculate, if this is done right, the overtime should go down. And the reason the overtime should go down is right now with 2 staff members on a shift, if one is sick or one is out, somebody has to come in and replace them. The staffing plan, as I understand it in terms of the agreement, and Christine, you can correct me if I'm wrong, this staffing plan does not require that there's always 3 people. So if one person were sick, it would be up at to the discretion of the fire chief of whether or not, and there may be some times where it makes sense to replace them, so it's not like they'll never be replaced. But I would expect that, if all the rules stayed exactly the same, you might say, well, if you increase the staff 50%, then chances are overtime's gonna go up 50%. I actually think that we should expect overtime to go down at least modestly. And that did not factor into this net cost.
Yep, okay. The second issue is just a comment, really, and I thank you for having the OPEB and the pension costs in there. I just think it's very illuminating to see that. So that's a $5,000 cost per year per employee of the town. And so that, I assume that goes across the board for every town employee, basically, probably.
Yeah, we had, I think Christine was the one who pried that number out of our actuaries. Actuaries don't like to give you numbers like that because it's an aggregate number that's the average across a range of people who all will have different experiences, and they like to, I think, model each one individually or at least subgroups. So that's a correct, I think for a financial policy standpoint,
Yeah, that's a very interesting
useful
figure for the
information.
town residents to know about. The third thing that I was curious about was the number of ALS versus BLS transports, and you've got this figure of 446, and I'm not quite sure from the chart whether that's just the ALS ones or whether that's a combination of both the ALS and the BLS.
Yeah, this was, well, actually, if you see,
I thought we were around 600
if you look at the
something.
Medfield Ambulance Financial Review, you're looking at this one here. That's the bottom one there.
Yeah.
So if you look on the right-hand column, it says BLS, ALS1, and ALS2.
Yeah.
So what's happening out of those 446, 56% are assumed to be BLS, 44% are that ALS1 in the model here.
Okay, so the 446 is the ambulance runs per year.
So, 446 ambulance runs per year. This is the FY 2018 status quo,
Yeah,
which
okay.
says slightly more than half the runs are BLS.
All right.
Okay.
And then on that next chart, next slide, you have the ALS usage going up from 44% to 65%. And is that because of what you were explaining about the proper coding of the calls?
So, and now I'm way out of my depth here, so Chief, you can feel free to jump in here. But basically what happens is that when you are ALS licensed and a call comes in, if the way that call is described is, my child fell out of a tree, they're on the ground, and they're not breathing, or I don't think they're breathing, that becomes an ALS call. And the state, and this is not subterfuge, basically the state allows a call that comes in that's legitimately could be an ALS call to be classified as an ALS call. If it is classified as an ALS call, then the town can recover the fees for an ALS call, even if by the time the ambulance gets there, it turns out the kid was breathing, he's sitting up, and he has a broken leg, and it's a BLS call. It's called the cost of readiness. So the whole idea is that if you're gonna have this level of capability, it's gonna cost more to do it. And so the state allows you to recover some of that cost by allowing a more that's where that $50,000 comes from, is you can legitimately classify things as an ALS call, even if it doesn't turn out to be.
All right,
ALS.
so, but that's really just, we haven't been coding properly in the past, apparently.
I don't know
Or
that
as carefully as we could have to get.
I don't know, I'm not sure if it's that we haven't coded properly, or if as a BLS licensed fire station, we're not gonna, we don't
haven't
have any reason to code something as an ALS.
Yep, okay, understood. Thank you. Those were my questions.
I just have one question, and then we'll get to comments. With respect to ALS staffing and certification, we need 8 paramedics. Is that right? So in the long run, once we get to the point of having 8 paramedics, we would not need to replace retiring or departing EMTs as long as we maintain 8 paramedics. So in other words, the increase to 12 could be temporary until, and then return to 8 total.
The issue we are dealing with on the ALS study committee is acquiring the ALS capability. That requires 8 paramedics. Beyond that, I would go to the new fire chief, and I think I'd look to the new fire chief to figure out what makes the most sense.
All right, we will do questions and comments for Gus until no later than 8:10, and then we'll hear from Steve Caskey. So questions, comments, responses. Yes, sir, in the back. The only thing I will ask is, please identify yourself and where you live. Street name is fine, and please use the microphone.
Justin Ziegler, Vinebrook Road. The first question I have is, did you do any sort of stress test on the cost benefit of this program versus private? The reason you talk about the contract being in negotiation right now, but you kept it at flat. You talk about healthcare kind of being flat, and I don't envy you this discussion, but there's a lot of things that could say those numbers could be vastly different than what we're talking about right now.
I think you need to hear what Steve has to say first before I simply run over things on that. I didn't really fully explain. I talked about regionalization and talked about how that didn't work. We just couldn't find partners that wanted to do that. I didn't talk about the private side. The private side, when we looked at it, Steve may have, I don't know what numbers you have, Steve. We were looking at the price of that being at least 600,000. And when we asked for, we put out an RFI, we got numbers as high as 800,000 or 900,000. So the private ambulance service was significantly higher. So if that's the kind of stress test you're talking about, yes, we did do that. If you're talking about did we project out what the growth in ambulance fees are going to be over the next 10 years, no, we didn't do that.
More just simple, like labor costs / equipment costs against revenue projections you might get from Dover or Sherborne, like you mentioned, and it sounds like everything's flat, so it's just.
Well, the reason we didn't get into, I mean, we know that everything's not flat, except that we don't believe that, a town staff is not flat and private ambulance services are. So that when you talk about inflation, what Brendan used in his projections, he didn't do long-term projections, but he did look out a year or two. He was projecting things like 3% growth. So we tried to conservatively estimate the revenue side. We, in some ways, by using current rates, we probably underestimated what it's really gonna cost for a paramedic, because we just kind of used what we had now. I know one thing, the stipend cost we used was an existing stipend cost, and I think we'll be, good chance we'd be higher than that. On the other hand, we didn't do anything around overtime, so we kind of felt like we went a little short on some things and went a little long on others, and it was the best stake we could put in the ground.
And just one real quick follow-up, I think we were talking about the program having 8 paramedics be ALS compliant. Is there any, what happens if someone leaves unexpectedly, not because they wanted to leave, but or because they had to leave? What happens if you drop to 7? Do we lose our accreditation, or how does that work out?
I doubt that, but now you know why I hedged on Mike's question, because I'm thinking about what happens when you only have 8 and you lose one, if that's the full thing. There has to be some way to keep a robust staff going. But Chief, if you
Could just pass the microphone over
what
to
happens?
Chief Hollingshead.
The question is, if you had eight paramedics and you were licensed for ALS and one of them took another job, are you dead in the water until?
No, to answer that question, specifically, no. Part of the whole state application process and waiver process, we could keep the waiver going, and they would understand that process. So if we went down to 7 and process of going out and hiring that eighth, we would be okay. If I may, and clarify one point we talked about, I missed the question relative to the privates. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the private quotes were on intercept only.
Correct.
That did not include any ambulance. So if the private numbers that we looked at was only for intercept only, that a private company would come in and be housed somewhere with an intercept vehicle. Could be an SUV or whatever it is, and they'd have their equipment, but they would still be using Medfield's ambulance to transport. Okay, so when we talk private right now, we haven't gotten into the full price of an ALS transport from a private service. So these numbers that were quoted are primarily for intercept service.
Thanks, Steve. For those who don't know, if you think of an ambulance run, this is just me, the dumb guy, so I can simplify it. There's two things that happen. One, the paramedics need to show up and be able to treat. That's the intercept part. Transport is the other part, which is the ambulance that takes the patient to the hospital. When we get mutual aid from Westwood or Walpole, most of the time, they send the paramedics out not in an ambulance that can carry a patient, but in a truck that has all the equipment. They treat them, and then we send our ambulance out to actually transport. When you do that, you split the ambulance fee.
Yes, Abby.
Abby Marble, 16 Pheasant Road. Chief actually touched on it a bit. We're going to need a one-time upgrade of our ambulance, and I don't see that in your costs, and I'm wondering how much is it and where that money's coming from.
So I'm going to, if he's up for it, I'm going to refer that question to Jeff Minotti, because there are costs, but I think a lot of them have been taken care of. So Jeff, you're at the front of this. Why don't you explain what you've been doing?
Okay. We do not need to upgrade the ambulance itself. It's merely an equipment upgrade. Chief, we have to work out the cost. It's kind of a fluid number. I didn't want to get any numbers or bids from providers or my vendors where we get our regular medical supplies from until we have a firm vote, and then I would go out to bid. So it's just an equipment upgrade. Gus, you'd have to refresh my memory on what we projected up.
Well, so two points on that. One, the number we threw around a year ago on equipment, around the upgrade, was $150,000, of which I think some of that has already been acquired. And second, Chief Hollingshead at least has mentioned in a couple of our meetings that there probably are ways to get a grant for that one-time capital expense. So there's nothing in the override that, we haven't actually built anything into the override request that covers the purchase of that one-time equipment, because it appeared there was enough optimism that that can be procured without having to get on taxes.
And just to know, there are seats here in the front for people who are standing up. If anyone would like to come sit in front, just feel free to come on up. Like,
Follow up on that?
Sure.
A question relative to the ALS equipment. When we look to upgrade to an ALS service, one of the primary costs is a 12-lead monitor, a cardiac monitor that's going to basically do a tremendous amount of evaluation. One of the skills of paramedic is their diagnostic skills. Right now, the average cost of a new 12-lead is about $38,000. So the state's going to require us relative to about $38,000 to $40,000 for the cardiac monitors. Plus, if we want to look at, I don't want to say a recondition unit, but the state allows a recondition unit as a backup. You have to have a backup. So you're looking at about $60,000 relative to the 12-lead. There's some other items that I know that we've, in foresight, the department has acquired. There might be one or two other things. So that, in all honesty, we didn't include those because I think that those are items that we can work internally to make it happen.
yes, ma'am, right there.
Hi, Mara Ziegler, 31 Vinebrook Road. So what we're talking about is the cost to hire 4 paramedics, and we're saying we need 8, right? So we have 6 because 2 are existing. What would be the all-in cost for 8? And then what else isn't included, right? If we're talking about equipment upgrades and special equipment that we need, and none of that's included in this override number, but somebody's paying for it, right? We're all paying for it. What are those numbers?
So
And why aren't they included?
So the full-up cost for the 6, so there's 4 new paramedics. The 2 additional paramedics beyond the 2 that we already have are swapping out EMTs for paramedics.
Right.
So that's the cost, if there's any incremental cost, it's the difference in what a paramedic gets paid versus what an EMT gets paid.
that is?
I guess I can't put any of our paramedics on the spot about what they get paid, but
Okay.
for the best of, I mean, if, what we're doing is,
It's the same salary amount, it's the difference in the stipend, and we're currently in contract bargaining discussions to do the stipends.
But in terms of equipment, that could be expensive, right?
so
And
the
then upkeep on all that equipment. And then I think one of the things that I keep hearing in a lot of these meetings are the rise in healthcare costs, right? That seem to be more than we expect, right? So how does that affect us longer term? Is that encompassed in this? Because it seems like the 250 is a small portion.
So I think there's a couple, the answer to that a couple ways. First off, the long-term direction of healthcare costs, I'm not sure. One of the things we were asked to look at was kind of long-term direction of emergency services, and we didn't do a comprehensive research effort on that, but the 2 trends that appear to be potentially pushing in opposite directions, one being telemedicine, where you might be able to get away with a person in an ambulance with a doctor at a hospital viewing what's going on and directing that person through telemedicine. Perhaps you could get by with a less skilled person in the ambulance if the doctor's telling them what to do through a video linkage. The other trend is paramedicine, which is the trend that says to hold down healthcare costs. What we want to do is not have to bring people to the hospital all the time. So suddenly, the ambulance ALS type services could involve paramedics providing home care in order not to be able to. And I'm no expert in this area, but I can see one possibly driving down the skill requirement, and I can see the other one, which I find far more intriguing, of having an emergency service in town that's not merely a transport to the hospital, but actually almost the replacement of the old kind of doctor that used to do house calls to keep people, in which case suddenly I could see emergency services by the town blossoming, if that's the trend in healthcare. So the equipment costs you're talking about, the same equipment costs that Chief Hollingshead just talked about, so they're one-time capital costs. I think you got to about 60 or 80,000. When these first came up a year ago, it was 150,000. The point is, the reason that it's not in the request, this is me speaking at least, is because the fire department either has to figure out how to pay this stuff out of the budget that they have right now, or Chief Hollingshead mentioned that there are grants out there that help departments come up to speed. So this is, I would not expect this to be a message a year from now that says, oh, we hired them all, we forgot to outfit the ambulance, we need another $150,000. I don't think that's gonna happen.
Martha,
Yes.
that's just,
I was gonna go right behind you, Martha, first. Yeah.
go ahead, you had your hand I've just got a quick one. Martha Festa, 16 Quail Run. I think last year when we were talking about capital costs, we were talking about just 4 additional outfits of equipment for the individuals as well.
Oh, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So on that paramedic cost that I used, there is something in that 97,000 we didn't count. There's also a $3,200 one-time cost, and that's getting the protective clothing for the paramedic. So sorry, I forgot that piece.
Thank you. Elizabeth Witcher, Indian Hill Road. I've seen this concern brought up, this question asked, and I've never been able to figure out an answer to it. So if we are currently staffed at 8 full-time staff and we're hiring 4 more to bring us to 12, that means we're going to have, I think, 6 non-paramedic staff that we're keeping on. And
No. We want 8 paramedics, and we want to drop down to 4 non-paramedic staff.
Okay, so 4 non-paramedic staff. So I guess the question is, is it possible to restructure those jobs? Has this been considered? Like, are those jobs able to be reclassified? Because we are hiring more staff at a cost to the town, and arguably the 4 EMTs, I understand there's an operational advantage. as to why we're keeping them on. But it sounds like it's not a necessity because we are considering dropping them once we get to the 8
So I think,
full-time paramedics. So is there anything we can keep to avoid to keep the department at 8 is my question.
I don't think there's anything we can do unless we would like to start a major labor war to do that. However, and I don't think this town has ever elected that path with its workers. I think it's safe to say, and Mike or Christine, correct me, the town will be absolutely supportive of any EMTs that choose to get their paramedic qualification. I think would be our first preference on how we would go about getting paramedics. And if anybody, I think that's a fair statement. A year ago, I got into a little bit of a discussion around this before the last town meeting, around the last election, and I did learn from some of the people who posted that the decision to go from being an EMT to being a paramedic is not merely just, oh, that's what you need, that's what I'll be. I don't know, this is not technically or medically accurate, but what drives home for me is if somebody were not breathing and I had to provide, or so their heart had stopped and I had to provide CPR or, mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, I think I'd be okay doing that. If somebody wasn't breathing and I had to give them a tracheotomy, I think it would be a little more daunting proposition for me. And I think it's an oversimplified picture, but for me, to understand why an EMT wouldn't jump at the chance to be a paramedic, I think it has to do with that. That it's a much more extensive capability that you've got to be sure you're ready for.
Okay. If I could just add on to that, then I would suggest that be made clearer across the board as the committee's providing this information to the town, why we are going from 8 to 12 and why anything, below that is not advisable, because that's something I haven't heard.
Okay.
So we are at 8:10, which is the artificial deadline that I'm going to enforce.
Can I make one last statement before you switch?
I shouldn't have called it an artificial deadline. Yes, go ahead.
I want to leave you with one last thought, because a lot of these discussions have been around the cost. This actually isn't a cost decision by itself. This is actually, I'm going to say a moral decision, but I don't mean you're being moral if you vote for it and you're being immoral if you're not. I'm saying that there's a certain capability that we are trying to acquire. We're trying to provide an option for acquiring to this town. That capability has a price tag. And you all have to decide whether what that capability gives us justifies the price tag. It's not just a question of we're spending money and let's not spend money. For once, the legislative people, the taxpayers, when they come to town meeting, you really are going to have to make a decision, and you got to think about the decision you make.
Thank you. All right, Steve. We'll hear now from Steve Caskey, who's a member of the ALS Study Committee. He has an alternative proposal to present, as I understand, on behalf of himself and one other member as well, Steve?
Yes.
Okay. So, Steve, if you can, come up to there.
I'm only going to take 2 or 3 questions, maybe.
Well,
I'm
that's
just
up to
kidding.
me.
Just kidding.
You can
Just
take how many
kidding.
you want, but
No, I'm just kidding.
You can answer however many you want, but
I'm just kidding. All right.
The floor is yours.
So I worked on this presentation with Holly Rand, who's, as Gus mentioned, she's a cardiologist PA, and she had some real strong points on this as well, and one of them I'm going to get to during my presentation. So I'm gonna read off these papers because I'm pretty nervous too as well. I'm not as seasoned as these guys up here. So for the last 10 months, we have met as a committee to find the most economical possible way to bring ALS to the residents of Medfield. What we have overlooked is that the most economical possible way is not always the best possible way, and that's why I feel like going the private route for now is in the best interest of the town. As a resident who is feeling the crunch of rising taxes and fees, this was a very difficult decision. After meeting with many members of our community who are in the medical profession, I feel like the extra costs will be the best choice and less expensive in the long run with a better quality of care. Some of the examples of why hiring is not in the best interest of the town are in private advantages. We will have full ALS immediately. With privatization, there will be day 1 service as of July 1st. This means we will not rely on mutual aid. The private option will backfill paramedics while the paramedics that we have out on call are already out. Discontinuation of mutual aid reliance. Westwood and Walpole stated as of July 1st, 2018, they will no longer support mutual aid to Medfield. However, they have agreed to continue to support Dover, and Sherborne, who do not currently have capability to provide mutual aid. And pending contract negotiations. With these unknown financial conclusions of the contracts, it is difficult to establish the true cost of paramedic personnel. Current proposal operational date is undetermined. By budget request, it would be fair to speculate January as the earliest start time. This brings to question the financial speculations that's used to validate the under request funding requirements that are presented. Employee costs alone equal or more than $400,000 due to CBA questions. $250,000 cost projections based on $150,000 in recoverable funds would need a full functional ALS service. The time it would take for Medfield's fire department to build up its ALS service would continue to draw on mutual aid from surrounding towns. Even when operational, we would draw on other towns as a result of having at least half of our shifts being covered by only one paramedic. Per medical control, there is a list of serious calls that would require 2 paramedics needing mutual aid response. This would come at a cost that further calls into question the financial recoverable cost used to keep the service estimates at $250,000. The hiring of 4 firefighter employees would still leave us 2 paramedics short. To reach full ALS status of 8 paramedics, they would need to acquire a total of 6 more than the 2 they already have, which will cost an additional $200,000. This does not include the full financial costs the 2 existing paramedics that are already earning, nor the full benefits to the town that will have to sustain the 6 add-on. This could equal approximately $700,000 a year. So, price approximately $500 to $850 for full ALS status of 8 employees. There are currently 3 preliminary company bids for the requested private service. The price of these bids could be brought down with the extended service Medfield ALS would be able to provide surrounding towns as of July 1st. This includes Dover and Sherborne, who are also looking for help, and they don't have full ALS. Slide 3. So as you can see, that's our current staffing. The black line represents what the staffs are per shifts. And you can see my committee recommendation, our committee's recommendation of hiring of 4. If Neil could fix that a little bit. I think we can get a good idea. You can see 2 shifts will be covered with 2 paramedics, and the other 2 shifts would only be covered with 1. So that would leave us only half of the time covered full ALS. And then the proposed private option will give us 4 total staff members, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This gives us the flexibility to split personnel in conditions related to multiple simultaneous calls to provide broader coverage to the town of Medfield or surrounding towns that require mutual aid. This gives us a total of 10 medics. Half of our shifts would be covered with 3 medics. I'm sorry, what's that?
They're just paramedics, they're not firefighters, so they only.
No, I know that. Are we taking questions now, or?
Yeah, we'll just wait till the end. There'll be questions
you.
at the end.
Skill retention. On average, private paramedics respond to 700 ALS calls a year. An in-house Medfield paramedic projected would only see an average of 24 ALS calls a year. Approximately 400 to 500 EMS calls a year, and the average of those calls are about 190 ALS calls a year. Our EMS numbers have been stable since 1998, and this was Holly's big point, was skill degradation. And there's been many studies and numerous scientific studies that claim this negatively impacts patient outcomes in low volume areas like Medfield. Private negotiate in the contract years of experience, hands-on patient care hours, and rotation of paramedics through high higher volume towns to maintain skills as well as the availability to pick up overtime. Okay, slide 6, benefits, thank you. Personnel management outsourced. If an employee does not meet professional patient standards of care and professionalism, we have the flexibility to have the private company replace the employee, which can be a much more challenging process with town contracted employees. Eliminate financial risk associated with illness and injury. Workman's compensation overtime for personnel injury in high-impact EMS jobs like paramedicine and fire departments can be financially exhaustive to small towns. Private companies will be required to provide replacement personnel at no additional cost to the town. So for example, if somebody blows a back out, breaks a leg, it's not the town's problem to incur the overtime. They will replace that person, so there's no cost at all to the town. And why privatization? This gives us the flexibility to allow future adjustments to service and to build the Medfield ALS through attrition, and gives our current staff the opportunity to advance their career from EMT to paramedic if they so choose. Plan within a 3 to 4 year or alternative terms of private ambulance company contract to decide what direction we want to take in ALS in Medfield. This gives us time to account for population growth, the Medfield State Hospital project, educational overrides, and all other issues currently affecting Medfield's current budget. This is a minimal increase in pricing for a short period of time and avoids committing Medfield to a 60-year staffing obligation, including pensions and health insurance. If we build up Medfield's ALS, our current unfunded pension liabilities is hovering around $39 million. Long-term options. We can explore regionalization more fully. In the 10 months that the ALS committee has convened, we have been unable to truly explore regionalization with other towns through policymakers. Private ambulance gives Medfield the flexibility to fully engage other towns in conversations regarding true ALS regionalization. I know myself, I went to Sherborne and met with the Sherborne town administrator, and he seemed kind of on board. It was something that was very appealing, but as I think they talked to the fire chief and selectmen, I think it kind of weaned out, and I don't think we were. I think Dover was kind of in the same boat. I think Dover really didn't have too much of an interest at this point in exploring that route.
They don't even want their rail trail to get to Medfield.
It's true.
No impact on the on-call fire personnel. Contrary to the hiring of 4 firefighters negatively impacting the already existing on-call personnel, private will only answer the EMS calls and leave all fire calls till full-time and on-call department. And in conclusion, this is a long one, so bear with me. I know it's hot in here, I know. Hiring a private company will enable us to be full status ALS, meaning as of July 1st, the town of Medfield will be self-reliant 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It will take years for us to hire, train, and staff the additional 6 paramedics on the department needed to achieve full ALS. Medical control states that we will not provide full ALS, and we will still need to rely on mutual aid for half of our shifts until we have 8 paramedics on the department. Without mutual aid from Walpole and Westwood, this leaves our town uncovered for ALS as of July 1st. Medfield will need to hire at least 2 more paramedics in addition to the recommended 4 to have full ALS capabilities. The cost would be 1 additional employee at approximately $100,000. This is dependent on the retirement of 1 person who would also need a replacement. The next closest person to retirement is, and I think we talked about this in the meeting, I don't know if I can say that here, you know, roughly 10 years out.
Well, yeah, the other issue is whether any of them are gonna get a paramedic certification.
Yeah, if they decide. So that's 10 years away, and that does not account for people self-terminating and heading to higher volume towns. This makes the timeline reaching full ALS status unpredictable. If towns such as Westwood and Walpole decide they will continue to not provide us with mutual aid, our residents run the risk of further injury due to the lack of the second medic. I understand this option's cost is more money up front, but this option gives us immediate, full coverage while not being at the mercy of other towns' policymakers. How long is it until we are back here again seeing stories on social media of residents who have to wait for a mutual aid call, and especially ones that don't even have medics that are unable to show up at the scene? Newly hired chief, and I think it's Carico, stated, "We have to have the availability to call the second medic. A priority 2 patient can have 2 paramedics touching that patient. That perfect model is 2 paramedics on every EMS call. We have to have a method of getting the second paramedic. If someone calls in with chest pains or cardiac arrest, you need 2 paramedics moving right away, which is extremely important. Hiring 4 will not give us that service this town needs. Those cases would lose precious minutes needing to wait for another town's medic to arrive. Hiring a private company, however, will give us that safety and quality of care that our children, elderly, and disabled deserve." I would also like to thank, and Gus touched on it, Holly, Gus, who spent a ton of time, Chief Meany, Tom Marie for his brief time with us, which was pleasurable, Neil, Jeff Bonatti, Brendan, and Christine, and Chief Hollingshead, which was great, and Sean Kay, who showed up at, for numerous meetings and chimed in. All these people took time away from their families and activities to get us to this point. I would also like to thank the residents who attended our meetings and added valuable input and opinions. I want to also recognize Caitlin Ciancarelli, I think I said that correct. Thank you. Who came forward with her experience in needing ALS and went on a mission to educate the residents in such a positive manner. I understand this is an emotional subject with many viewpoints and opinions. I am hoping we can keep this dialogue positive instead of adversarial moving forward. Many of us want the same thing. We are lucky to have 2 options that can achieve this. All right,
Thank you,
guys.
Steve. Pete, question?
So, Steve, you mentioned I guess the first thing I wanted to focus on was that cost difference, because Gus's numbers were like $400,000 a year, and then you quoted, I think, $500,000 to $850,000 a year. And is that $500,000 to $850,000 for us doing, the town doing the paramedics on our own, or?
That's private.
That's the private
option, yep.
cost.
Yes, sir.
And so I guess then the other 2 things are just comments that you've given me a lot to think about. I thought it was fairly clear, but your points I think are interesting. ALS right away, skill degradation, that resonates with me certainly. So, no more questions.
Just a couple of questions. You mentioned the 3 bids that we received, and were those the bids in response to the RFI?
Yes,
And they range from 500 to 850.
correct. Or it could be 900, somewhere right around there. It was pretty wide ranging.
All right. And that was for 1 year?
I think first year, and I think it accelerated. I'm not sure.
Okay. I mean, they didn't give us like a term, we'd agree to 500,000 a year for 3 years. It was just sort of.
They were a 3-year term.
3-year term?
3-year term.
Okay.
And they're
With some kind of an
escalated.
escalator?
They escalated in the 3 years.
5% or whatever?
Roughly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and then, kind of, where would the ambulance be kind of in these proposals?
One of the options was at our station.
Okay. I assume
The other, if our town refuses that, they will have to be stored in-house, rent a space in Medfield, when in-house meaning in Medfield. So they wouldn't be stored in Millis or any other surrounding towns, they would have to be in Medfield.
And I assume having it here costs more than otherwise.
What's that?
I assume of the range, having the ambulance here would be more expensive than having it someplace else?
Actually, having it in-station is cheaper than having them to rent somewhere else. And I think a number that they used as a possibility in rough, I don't know, Neil, if you remember, I think it was around 14 to 15,000 a year is what their cost would have to. What's that?
That seemed low, but yeah.
Yeah, whatever they quoted, I'm not sure.
Right. So the ambulance would be in the station, and then would it only be responding to calls in Medfield, or would it be responding to calls elsewhere too?
They have the availability to respond. They had mentioned that in a meeting that they would also do mutual aid in surrounding towns as well.
But the RFI that I had, that I put out was dedicated to Medfield only. It would be with the Board of Selectmen's approval that they would allow for mutual aid.
On a case-by-case basis, or?
They have to call you at your house. And then Mike,
We're getting called at home, this could be a problem, this could be a problem.
Just to think about that, though, if we said that we wouldn't do that for other towns, we couldn't then turn around and expect other towns to do it, so mutual aid is mutual aid.
All right, so cost, we have the range from 500 to 850, and presumably we'd have to, we have to do an official RFP to actually award the contract, or can we award a contract based on these RFIs?
I only have 2 responses to the RFI. I don't have 3.
Where's the third one?
I think it was sent in late after.
It was withdrawn.
Oh, okay. So we got 2.5? 2 3/4?
2 7/8.
2 7/8.
I would recommend a full proposal.
Yeah.
I think does that have to be done?
It's actually not subject to 30B. You can award it, but I would recommend a full proposal.
All right. Let me see. And so what would be, in this proposal, what would be the size of the override you're looking for?
I'm gonna guess 500,000 or 550,000, right in that area. And again, it's subject to whatever the town decides to accept.
Right, but we got to pick a number a week from Monday.
Yeah.
And so if it's 550, then we're kind of committing to go with the respondent at 550. Okay. So yes, we should get more information about who the 550 one is, because that's going to be the number requested. Then we're sort of, it's kind of one-stop shopping.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned kind of in the interim period here that you'd still be or you'd still be encouraging in some way the existing staff to upgrade.
Yeah, that would be eventually, if that's the case, that would be the goal.
Okay.
And that's what the good thing about private is, it gives us that option. We're not married to it. After 3 years, if 2 or 3 in-town EMTs decide to go that way, and that's great. That gives us the options. We're not stuck.
All right. Okay. Did the committee take a vote on this proposal in particular?
The vote was 4-2, 4 in favor of the presentation, the option that I just presented, and 2 for Steve's.
All right. Just from an overall standpoint, if we went this route, just from a kind of picture of emergency services, we'd still have 2 EMT firefighters on staff.
Yes.
Plus, we'd have this ambulance, and you said 4 medics. There'd be four medics in 2 ambulances, or who?
It'd be two medics with 2 EMTs.
So there'd be 4 total.
There'd be 4 total, yeah.
4 total from the private company.
No, 2 per shift from the private company. So
okay.
if
Existing
Yeah.
staff right now in the
Yes.
fire department, plus 2 additional.
And then on half of our shifts, we would have 3 paramedics total, because we have,
From the private company.
no, we have our 2, and then the private company has 8.
Okay. And so you'd had then our paramedic would be going out with the private company?
Or intercept, they wouldn't intercept with them?
Okay.
Well, that's something logistically, but I know we have 2 paramedics on staff.
Right.
In hiring a private company would give us the 8 other paramedics, so I'm not,
But I would think wouldn't we still have the issue of our department wouldn't be at an ALS level if we still were there? We'd still be at a BLS level.
So they can't function as medics.
So they couldn't
oh, they
function
can,
as
okay.
medics.
So then we would use the 2 paramedics.
Right, so it would just be the paramedic services. And what about on BLS calls? Under your proposal, do you imagine that would still be done by Medfield Fire, or would that be
Medfield
part of?
Fire, yeah, because then that way they recoup the funds.
Okay, so really then this private company is only answering whatever percentage of calls are ALS calls?
Which is our major need, which is why we're all here.
Okay. Those are my questions. I imagine people here may have others. Please put your hand up, identify your street and to whom your question is directed. Start with Mr. Kraus.
John Kraus, Emerson Road. I just wanted to ask if there were apparently 2 proposals that were actually submitted to the RFI within the designated time. I was just curious what the costs of those 2 proposals were, or the lowest, highest.
Between 750 and 900,000.
For intercept only, correct?
For intercept only.
So then, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you and ask a question because, I mean, you've described the cost as not an intercept service, correct? Like
No, it's an intercept service. So that way, the companies that provide the intercept with the ambulance, the town will recoup that money back. So if the town provides the wheels and transports the patients along with a private company, then the town will recoup that money back.
But it's to be an intercept service, but they're sitting in the fire station.
Correct. So if there's a call per se that goes out, then the EMS service will go out along with the paramedics as well. So I'm not sure, the logistics, it depends up to the new chief, how that's gonna be operated, if they're gonna hop in a Medfield ambulance, or if they're just gonna go with their own intercept vehicle to the scene and then split back up and one comes back, depending on the.
So they won't have an actual ambulance, it'll be our ambulance?
Correct.
Ah,
And that's what generates us that income coming back to the town.
got it. All right, sorry to interrupt.
So Steve, we get the income from that then, or the ambulance, private ambulance? company?
No, the town gets the income on those calls.
The paramedic calls from the private ambulance company, or the?
Because and I think you can explain it better, the wheels get the calls, the income?
I'm sorry?
Oh,
wheels
because it's
get the
our
income.
ambulance, we get the money?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Transport part of
Yes.
the fee, though.
Yeah,
So
transport
again,
is
if you
split.
think of the fee as being intercept fee, transport fee, presumably they would keep the intercept part of it.
Yep.
We would
All
get the
right, yep,
transport.
got it.
So if it's like a $2,000 call, they get $400, and the town of Medfield gets $1,600. And
All right.
whatever it is. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Caitlin Gingrelli.
Wait, you need a microphone. There's lots of people gonna be watching this on YouTube, so we gotta record this.
I just had a quick question. I may have missed it because I had a flat tire outside, so I had to run outside. But the 550 number, if we go in and ask for 550 for private, if we have two numbers or two RFIs that are higher than that, are we at risk of asking for 550, approving 550, and then not getting an ambulance to commit to that, and then we're left with nothing?
I mean, I can't speak on what they're gonna do. If they do the bid and they come back and honor that bid, what do you mean?
But is one of the bids actually at, like, we can actually get a bid for 550? Because I thought
That's
the
gonna
two
have
that
to be
we.
put back out in a RFP.
That
was the one
that was removed. Okay. Because it came in late. Oh, it
So-
was removed because it came in late, not
No,
because they.
no, it was not removed because it came in late. The company withdrew it.
Okay.
Because I had already issued the amounts that the other RFI came out of at a public meeting, so they withdrew it.
Okay, so they didn't withdraw because they. So we
They-
still
they'd
could be at
initially-
risk.
They'd initially indicated they did not want to bid on the project.
Okay.
And then about a month after they were due, they sent a proposal in. I had already released what the numbers were from the other companies, so they withdrew it.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand from a town perspective if we're going to be at risk of not being able to get any company to commit to 550, and then as a town, and then we have nothing because we're losing service on 7-1 from neighbors. That's all I'm just trying to
Yep.
understand.
And that goes back to the proposals, in how we end up doing that with the RFPs, so.
I mean, it would just, I mean, this is just thinking out loud here. I mean, it would seem as though there's a risk at least that it would be higher, and so that I think if we were gonna go this route, you might wanna have some wiggle room in that amount.
Yep.
I mean, because, I mean, conceivably, I mean, if they withdrew it after the numbers were released.
Well, and just really quick on those numbers, they attended meetings, they gave a quote on what they wanted. They actually gave a quote previous as well, and that quote was in line with what they originally gave as well. So it wasn't like they just pulled a number out of nowhere. So this number was in line with numerous quotes that they had given to the town. So this isn't like they came in at 700,000 and came back in at 550. This
Right.
was in line with what they had stated in previous meetings when they had attended. So, just even if numbers were given out, it wasn't like it would have mattered.
Okay.
Because this number was discovered, this number was talked about numerous times at meetings.
All right, over there. Martha, I'm gonna skip over you again. Sorry.
My name is Steve. My name is Steve Resch, and I at 656 Main Street. And I guess just when we're talking about these two different numbers, and I realize that the private one is sort of an uncertainty because of we have to go through this bidding process and so forth. But when we're considering the two options, it seems to me that you want to at least compare apples to apples. So if there is, just the way Gus described, that there's some money you recoup from the 400,000 in the town option, there's also some money that you recoup, the town recoups, I believe, in a private option. So just keep that in mind so that if you're subtracting 150,000 from the town option to get down to a warrant ask of 250, if the private company comes in at 700,000, you're still going to get back something like, maybe not exactly that, but something like 150 off the private option. So on net, it's going to be a lower number. Just so I think we should keep.
Your point is right. Whether it's 100, given that we used 150 as the fee we would generate doing it all ourselves, I'm guessing it's a smaller number, but you make a valid point.
And again, it's not only it's not just about cost, it's what we get from day one. So that difference in price is full ALS. So in those calls where we only have one medic on a vehicle, we're still going to need to stop for a second medic and hope that Westwood and Walpole has somebody available, because if they don't, there's medications that need to get pushed. Guess what? They're not getting it. So that's the difference also as well, where you're getting that full staff ALS.
Martha, next.
Okay, along the lines of going apples to apples, is there also a capital investment required for our ambulance in order to do the plan that you're talking about?
That was kind of on the same kind of grants that.
Okay, so neither have, they're both equivalently not accounted for that?
No.
Yeah, give Neil the microphone.
Neil O'Connor, 5 Phillips Street, also on the ALS committee. Some of the things to clarify is the private budget number is a flat fee to put a dedicated, non-transport paramedic unit within the town of Medfield that is dedicated for Medfield and to go to mutual aid responses as any other Medfield ambulance would be requested. It's not to go out to do private calls, nursing home calls, or anything else. It's dedicated here. Second thing is the equipment cost is one thing that we've talked about a number of times. We never really got good clarity on the ALS committee of what that upfront cost is. We know that applies to hiring in-house. As far as the private service aspect, the vehicle they use and all the equipment they bring, plus the 2 private paramedics per shift for a total of 8 personnel is included in that price at the $550,000 or $600,000. And that's where it gets into an issue of how do you compare your apples to apples. We're looking at hiring 4 people under the proposal for the fire department aspect. You still only get to 6 paramedics. You still have a number of shifts that you don't get full coverage of your ALS. The potential can be a draw on your billing side. So there's a number of things that are a little wishy-washy on both sides of the equation. If we can't get the bid where we're expecting it to be, yeah, we're in trouble. But a lot of the numbers that are used on the fire department side are also skeptical at best. The contract's a year old. We're using budget numbers that are old. We have $97,000 we put per cost per firefighter, but we didn't include the $3,200 for the initial year, equipment cost. So there's a number of things that are there, but they're not added into all the numbers. So there's a lot of unknowns on hiring. It's a crapshoot.
Well, Neil, I think in fairness, what we did is we focused on the recurring costs.
Correct.
That's fair.
We did.
And the one-time capital costs, as we said before, they are not included in the request because the intention here was either for that funding to come or through grants, which Chief Holling said felt like that was a good avenue, or the fire department's gonna have to figure out how to pay for that out of the budget that they currently have. So, I mean, it's a one-time cost, and it's.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep, no, one-time cost, but we just didn't really get a good grip on what that cost is. So it may be covered, it may not, it's a question.
Yeah, I just want to send the microphone back there, please. Thank you.
Justin Ziegler, Vinebrook Road again. Just one comment and one question. The first comment is just what would be helpful is to clarify the difference in staffing levels under the privatization proposal versus the full-blown ALS proposal. Because what I'm confused about hearing different voices is, how many paramedics are on duty at one point versus firefighters versus, what we actually get out of privatization versus full-blown. I'm not
I have a
decided
slide.
yet either.
Neil, could you pull the slide back up? If you wouldn't mind, just the staffing. You could probably come over here and see it better.
That's fine. But let me finish my question so I can pass the microphone on because I don't like speaking in front of people. What's to say that in the privatization thing, what are the sort of breaks in the contract that doesn't allow these guys to all of a sudden pack up and ship away at any given time? What kind of protections does the town have against some sort of arbitrary, unexpected
And I know that was
problem
discussed at our meetings, and Brendan touched on it. I think, Christine, was that with the bonding issues?
We'd have a bonding issue, but you'd have an issue, even if we were able to recover the bond from them, you would have to find another company.
Would there
obviously,
be
affiliated at
economic
that time.
consideration then maybe to have some sort of, okay.
I'm sorry, what's that?
There'd be some economic consideration back to the town,
And I'm-
and maybe we could have some sort of secondary thing lined up in case, say, hey, so we're not like left holding in a bag with,
Yeah.
with nothing. Well, I look at a lot of bankruptcies, I don't know that.
Abby Marble, 16 Pheasant. Adding on to that, we don't, if we were to train the paramedics, we don't have a way of retaining them here in town either. So that's the other side of the coin there.
Yeah, we also talked about that too, because I think the police department had an issue with employees leaving, and I know we kind of touched on that as well.
Other questions or comments? Chief Hollingshead. Oh, let's go to Teresa first.
Hi, Teresa James, 67 Harding. I guess I had a question. I was getting the impression that with privatization that you were promoting that it would be also a path to give us a little bit more time, then perhaps move into our own service in town. I guess I'm struggling with how that would even occur, because if you were training up your paramedics, but if there's a privatization team already in town, how would they get trained and utilize their experience?
They do it themselves, like they would if through attrition, as they would do, or if they step up and want to do it themselves anyways. Which
Yeah,
is what
I guess part of that is also then real life training and going on calls, and I guess I'm having a hard time seeing a switch. Like, I kind of feel like if it's privatization, or it's a town provided service.
Well, it could be either one, and again, it's up to the personnel if they decide to do it. And I think that's been asked as well, if personnel want, even going to this route, it's been asked if personnel want to become paramedics themselves. So it's just because that's the case doesn't mean if we're a private company, and we already have 2 paramedics on staff now, and I think moving forward, and I'm not sure if this was in the contract, is every new hire moving forward is going to be a paramedic, because I think we had talked about that. Is that the case? Yep. So moving forward, just to answer your question, moving forward, every new hire will be a paramedic.
It's probably fair to say at the time that that decision makes sense when you're planning to build your own paramedic staff. If you're committed to privatization, then you probably would have a hard time attracting paramedics to a BLS operation. So that, it's kind of like, the reason that was true is because the path was to acquire our own capability. If we don't do that, then it gets a little more problematic, I think.
Is that kind of what Millis did, though? Didn't Millis have a private company and then start building their own?
I don't know.
I thought they had hired a private company. They were using a private company along with other towns and then built their own. Or used events before they went out of business.
Chief Hollingshead.
Excuse me, thank you very much. I appreciate Steve's effort relative to put forward an option for people to think about. The town of Medfield has a tremendous decision to make come this town meeting. Not an easy one, because what we've been seeing and hearing is a very important discussion on finances, okay? And getting back to an earlier point, I've only been here a short time, but I have all the faith in the world relative to Mr. Sullivan, Christine, the town accountant, and the assistant town accountant relative to their numbers. Yes, is there a contract that's being negotiated, and that will add a certain percentage, okay? But for the most part, those numbers are fair and equitable, okay? A couple of quick points for clarity. It was mentioned earlier, and I want to make sure that people understand this point. When we talk about Westwood and Walpole, what Westwood and Walpole said to us is that come July 1, if this program doesn't move forward, that they're going to make a switch and they're not going to provide intercept service. But Westwood and Walpole also said to the fact that if we move forward with this program, they will continue to provide intercept service, okay? If as long as all the towns around us, they see Medfield moving forward, they will continue to provide ALS intercept, ALS backup. And that's the important thing. People get confused sometimes. They hear mutual aid. Mutual aid in the fire service is fire engines and all, you know, if you have a big fire. ALS is a whole different world, and I think that's where we've come around to here in this community as far as ALS. Right? Another quick point is that when we talk ALS, you talk ALS intercept, you talked of as far as the amount of money that you are going to spend. And Lieutenant Kingsbury wanted to jump up and speak to that. What you are doing in this process is that you are, if the community decides to move forward with hiring people, you are improving your fire service delivery program as well. And the reason I say that, and we didn't really want to get into a debate tonight, it was more information, but I think it's important for people to understand, is that if we, as a community, decide to move forward in hiring people, depending upon the priority of the call, if there were 3 firefighters on duty, and 2 of them presently are going to be a paramedic, and there's 1 EMT, based upon state law and our options, if it's a BLS call, we can send 1 paramedic and the EMT to Norwood Hospital and return that other full-time firefighter back to the station in the event that there's a second ALS call. And looking ahead strategically, what we do is we eventually equip a second piece of equipment, the squad. It's a mini pumper. We equip that with some ALS equipment, so that in the event the ambulance and the 1 paramedic is out of town, we get a simultaneous call. It gives us the flexibility to at least start another paramedic with the tools and equipment to be at somebody's house, and we're waiting for a mutual aid community to send the ambulance. With privatization, there's a big debate out there relative to the concept of mutual aid. If you do hire a private service, and I know you folks have spent a lot of time, there's been issues relative to, I think you've done that twice already, and we're 0 for 2 relative to private service. I think a private service will come in, sell us what's best, but I think you have some history to fall back on. We can, on both sides, we can make all the numbers.
Just really quick, just to interrupt you.
See, just let him finish, and then you can go.
All right, I didn't know.
Yeah, just let him finish.
Just,
and then
you know, points of discussion. Does the ALS mutual aid end when a community hires a private service? And where does that mutual aid come from? Does the private intercept company then provide a secondary intercept coming from Framingham or whatever? So that's another big question. What happens to your mutual aid if you do go private and that ALS intercept is on the way to Norwood or Needham or whatever it might be?
Chief, I'm going to stop you there.
Yep.
And then I know Mr. Caskey wants to respond.
Just real quick, 2 quick points. On the 0 for 2, the second one was the second strike you're talking about. That was an agreement between a bunch of towns that this specific company came in to provide as a first call, and surrounding towns didn't fulfill that promise and agreement. So therefore, they had no choice, from my understanding, except to pull out over time. So on that point, not necessarily, I don't blame the private company, I blame the people in those towns. So it wasn't like they just completely pulled out and said, I'm out of here, I'm not dealing with you guys.
And just to be clear, Steve, I mean, you're talking about a very different, I mean, that intercept service we didn't pay anything for.
No, this is the second time, I think.
Right, so we didn't pay anything for the intercept service. I mean, so you're talking about a substantial additional investment, which should provide a higher level. I mean, the kind of intercept service that we basically had forever.
Well, this is the second attempt. The first one was
doesn't
events.
exist anymore.
Exactly, that was events, and then another company came in to help us in the interim, and they had to deal with 4 or 5 towns, and they said, we need to be first priority, first call for this to work, and we're gonna give you such a low fee and a low cost.
I remember.
And then all of a sudden,
that's why we're here, Steve.
Exactly. Well, but again, the way it's described as an 0 for 2, it's only giving with a specific.
Right. But I mean, it's just I think I think the cost of the option you've outlined is a recognition of where we are in the market, in the sense that the options that existed in the past don't exist anymore.
And just really quick to touch on if 1 paramedic's out or if they're out, you know, and that was something we had talked about with the private companies. They would also roll other paramedics where they're in Norwood, or if they have wherever their hubs are, to come to Medfield in the interim, so we wouldn't have to rely on that mutual aid if there's an issue, or multiple issues, so that's something else too, and again, so we're not at the whim of Westwood and Walpole where they say, you know what, we don't, like they've done, and say, we don't wanna come to you anymore. Or we don't have medics to stop and meet you, so.
Okay, so I'm
And
gonna
again,
I'm gonna declare a 9 o'clock end to this discussion, according to that clock. So anyone with further questions or comments in the next 6.5 to 8 minutes. Yeah, Mr. Wolf.
Where's that microphone?
I think they got like 30 minutes. I think that's what
Jack Wolf, 17 Harding Street. 80 years old this month. Triple bypass. Renal artery stenosis. Severe arthritis, and the majority of the firefighters in the room would consider me slightly demented, if not more. Okay. But given that background, let me speak on behalf of privatization. For the past 5 years, we've had 190 ALS calls on the average. Very narrow range, 190 ALS calls per year on the average. Each ALS call takes no more than 3 hours. That's 3 hours. 3 times 190, 570. Just remember that number for a second. If we add the 4 firefighters that are proposed, that's going to add 8,000 hours a year of capacity. 570 over 8,000. Do the division in your head. We have a 7% utilization rate for these firefighters. This is not a productive program. It is not, as Steve has pointed out, one that keeps the skills of our firefighters and paramedics up. Clearly does not provide the level of utilization that an efficient and productive fire force really should have. The other piece I would ask you to think about is you've heard call firefighters mentioned. Part of the culture of this town is the culture of call firefighting. 20 years ago, I think we had 1 paid firefighter. Today, we have a good firefighting force, but it is supplemented by a dozen to 15 absolutely terrific call firefighters. If we bring in the extra capacity, a mix of paramedics and firefighting, I'm just going to suggest that over time, our call firefighters will disappear. I've talked to some of them, and they are deeply concerned about that, and that's part of the culture of the town, part of the efficiency of the fire force that we have today. So I would just say that we should really think very carefully about giving Steve's proposal some due consideration and look at alternates for regionalization. That has not, in my view, been worked hard enough here in town. So thank you, and I'll retire from dementia.
Or so you think, yes.
Yeah.
Lieutenant Kingsbury in the back there, do you still want to?
I'll just take a couple minutes. In Steve's proposal, he said that we're adding two.
Just want to identify yourself and where you live.
Lieutenant Kingsbury, I live at 44 Adams Street, Medfield. Part of the thing is he's putting 2 paramedics a shift in our station. If it's a BLS call, our firefighters will be transporting to the hospital. Then you have two paramedics that work for a private company that provide no other service to the town other than being paramedics. Okay, so you have 2 guys back at the station that are literally doing nothing other than waiting for another call. In regards to going mutual aid, we're getting an intercept vehicle. An intercept vehicle is not going mutual aid to Westwood or Walpole, Norfolk. They need a mutual aid ambulance, not an intercept truck. So your mutual aid thing is basically out, unless the private ambulance is going to bring a transport ambulance. In regards to backfilling with ALS, I'm just going to throw a Brewster because we use them. We tried to intercept with them over roughly 100 times. I think we hit them twice when they were providing back service. So it's not like this is a foolproof plan. No offense.
No, I know, but just to go back on the Brewster, were they hired by the town to provide that service, or were they just as extra help?
No, they were extra help.
Okay.
But I'm just saying, at the same time, 100 times we hit them twice. We had a cardiac arrest that they were supposed to be coming out for that they never showed up for. So I'm just saying, it's not all cut and dry.
And again, this is proposal. People have the right to vote any way they want. So.
I'm just trying to add a little bit more facts to the thing. It's not like they're not here for the total service.
Just to clarify one fact.
No, wait. So we've got Does anyone else want to speak? Otherwise, this is going to be the last person.
This is only, again, back to my.
You're the last up. You're the closer on this
Again,
one.
Justin Ziegler, Vinebrook, and probably from talking to you and talking to Steve and all the guys, just to clarify, when you're talking about your example of 2 paramedics going off from station, leaving 2 guys doing nothing, that suggests that the private guys aren't going to be prioritized to be the paramedics, whereas the firefighters should be back at the station. I mean, I guess I'm confused about why would we send out town paramedics when we hire the private paramedics and you waste the money.
We are the transporting vessel.
So they wouldn't use the, okay, so they'd just be 2 guys without an
They would
ambulance at the
intercept like
station.
what they had.
And there's an additional cost every run. that they
Even
do.
if we house the
Wait,
ambulance that we
what was
talked about in the
that?
deal?
I can't hear
We're going to have microphones if you want to be picked up for the.
No, I just, what's I'm confused now is that we have 2 paramedics with no ambulance at the station, when I've heard also that there's gonna be an ambulance house somewhere else or at the
No,
station in
the
Medfield.
paramedics will be operating out of a SUV, like what we had before with the vents.
Okay, so there will be vehicles.
Yes, they have their own vehicle.
It's not a transport vehicle.
Correct.
They can't transport you to the hospital in it.
Okay.
Let me explain that.
This is where it's getting really, really
Yeah.
confusing.
And I think that, and I.
Chief, 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
No, but this is important.
Starting now.
Starting now. The 2 vehicles, when we talk intercept, they are in an SUV. A Bronco, an Explorer, Suburban, whatever it is. When we talk ALS from our delivery service, it's an ambulance. There'll be ambulance transport from that respect. So there is a difference. When they say intercept, it's an SUV with the equipment.
So they would hop
Yeah,
into
Steve,
the-
you want to wrap up? But
Yeah.
You have the floor to conclude now.
Yeah, I'm not gonna take long. I think my
Take however
conclusion
long
was-
you want.
All right, how about
He sets artificial deadlines.
Yeah.
so
I
you
know.
can-
You have to talk for a minimum of 4 minutes now.
Oh,
Go.
jeez. Yeah, so the way that works is the paramedic would hop in the town of Medfield's vehicle, and that also helps the town recoup those funds as well. So that's also a big financial pickup for the town. So, and again, that also relies for that paramedic, if they need to go back with the town of Medfield firefighter as well, to go respond to other calls. So if there's another ALS call, or if there's a fire call, they call in on-call guys as well.
All right, and so following up from this, Gus, we have information sessions coming up. When?
So there is an information session at the center on Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock. We kind of targeted making it easier for seniors, but it's a public session, so if you would like to come to that, and I'm guessing it'll go from 2 to 4 at least, and we'll probably stay as long as we need to.
That's at the center on
That's at the
One
center
Icehouse
on
Road.
One Icehouse Road. We then have what we think will be a larger, more public information session on Wednesday, the 25th of April. This is concurrent with, I gather, the schools are running a Dale Street walkthrough tour starting at 6 o'clock, followed by an information session at 7 p.m. So my committee doesn't know this yet, but I'm going to suggest that what we do is we defer the start of our information session until 7:30. I talked to Mike Quinlan, who's involved in setting up the Dale Street session. Given that they're at Dale Street and we're right across the street of the Public Safety Building on the 25th of April, we could probably start by briefing people at 7:30 till, say, 8:15. Those people who want to learn about Dale Street will have already had an hour and a half plus, and we'll try to make it possible for anybody who wants to attend both to attend a good part of both of those sessions.
Steve, do you have anything to plug?
I'm good. I want to
Good.
get out of here.
All right. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, guys. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. So let's move on to Medfield State Hospital next.
Artificial deadlines have anything to do with artificial intelligence?
Only if they're intelligent deadlines.
Feel free to fill in some of the open seats up front.
A few more mistakes I found here, too.
All right. So where we left off, we had an extensive discussion last Thursday. If I could just ask the folks who are departing to depart in something a quieter fashion, so we can get on for folks who are sticking around. So we had a lengthy discussion last Thursday about kind of where we are with respect to the hospital master planning process, and we didn't quite finish as we reached the artificial deadline that was sent last Thursday night. But we obviously have a number of issues to decide in advance of the town meeting on the 30th, and kind of where we are in the process. So I thought we should resume that discussion tonight. I've given to Gus and Pete, and it's available as well, just some kind of discussion points and things that I think we have to address, and some of which I think there was a fair amount of consensus on in our last discussion. And some of which I think are just things we need to talk about what we're doing over the next few weeks. Since Steve is here, and Steve, you sent us an email this afternoon about kind of your proposal for how to proceed. I thought we'd start with that, if Pete and Gus are okay. And then we can kind of respond. So you wouldn't mind just sort of, I've read your email. I think you get it.
I did. I haven't I read it quick. So I haven't.
Did you see it as well?
I did, yep.
So we've gotten it, but if we want to get the microphone to Mr. Nolan.
This could be a transfer.
And then.
Everything I read sounded okay to me. It was quick, but everything I saw looked okay.
And then we also have, for those of you, that Sarah Raposa, who is still here, okay, very helpfully sent around kind of what the deadlines would be to hit for hearings with the planning board, moving towards a special town meeting in October. And so I thought, thank you, Sarah, for doing that, because it's an important schedule to keep in mind.
Some people are trying to talk to you.
So I don't have much to offer other than at our last meeting, we authorized our consultant to go forward and prepare a draft master plan for us based on everything we've done to date. And we can put a deadline of May 9 for that to be back to us. And we're going to circulate it to you, to the planning board, to the warrant committee. We're going to propose to have people review it and comment on it. And we'll see comments at our meeting on May 16th. And then we also had invited the planning board, warrant committee, and board of selectmen to have a joint meeting where we would have a presentation from our consultants about, especially about implementation strategies, and then have a discussion about that, at which point we would take all the input we've had on the draft, as well as the conversation from that meeting, and finalize our plan and submit it to you for your action. That's kind of our game plan to wrap it up. We're rapidly running out of funds, so we sort of set this in motion so that we have a plan to get done within our existing funding and hopefully get it finished product to you.
I think when we had traded emails on this today, Steve, and that master plan will include the zoning as well.
That's our understanding.
And so my question is, how much will be left of the contract, depending on how substantial the comments are on the draft, putting aside the master plan, on the draft zoning?
But it wasn't this, we took the.
Well, it's a sort of task-based contract, it's sort of, it's a combination of things. They sort of budget for us, and they have an obligation to produce the master plan. So it's, we're basically out of money on meetings after we have these two meetings. So as far as the level of input, I assume they're gonna respond to whatever comments we have on that, and we'll revise it accordingly. So it's not, I can't give you like a black and white as to, at some point say, oh, this is too crazy, you're asking us to rewrite the whole plan, but within reason, their contract is task-based. If we have comments, we want to change it, I'm assuming they're gonna make those revisions and then get us the final plan.
It's Christine's love. I'm just wondering what it says in the contract. In other words, if we go back to them and say, look, you have to change the zoning in these 4 ways, and you have to do this and do that,
It's not spelled out to that level of detail.
Okay. What do you think?
I think they'll do it. I'm just saying, if it amounted to so much that we said, well, we're throwing out that whole thing, we want you to do something totally different, I expect they would object to that and say,
transfer.
we're on this trajectory, and now suddenly you've asked us to do a plan, now you're, totally redoing the plan. But my sense is that if most zoning would be changing districts or whatever, you know, if we have a bunch of different districts, some being open space, some being residential, some being commercial, and the designation of what those districts are would easily be changed, so I don't think that would be such a huge revision, so.
No special thoughts at the moment.
I think you're on a good path, Steve. The zoning piece, to me, it's probably my ignorance, but to me, it's the plan is the thing that if we get to a plan that holds, the issue, the question I have in my mind, I guess, is we need to get to a plan that, even if it doesn't look like the greatest financial thing in the world, can't look like a major black hole next to a halfway decent plan, there's a, you know, financially, and I think that was a point that you raised last was it just a few days ago, last week.
More recently than you think it is.
Yeah, the zoning to me seems, at the point that you have a plan that says, here's what we're really thinking of, it seems to me the zoning, almost, there's work to be done, but it's getting the zoning through. It's not like there's a whole lot of stuff you do around zoning that's gonna turn everything else upside down. I'd be more concerned on McCabe's part if we had a plan that just barely eked across the finish line, and then you wind up getting inputs from people about this is so marginal that it's not good enough, and then we have to figure out what to do. But even there, I don't see the plan, you know, the point you made here around bringing in the commercial inputs, that's the voice that we really haven't had come in, and I am assuming that that voice will have an impact on at least the actual plan that we choose to implement. I would hope that it keeps the spirit of the master plan, but it's not like the master plan is a specification. It's the master plan as an expression of what the town would like to see in a way that it provides a reasonable trade-off on the financial end on what it would cost.
Agreed, and I think at some point when they're finished their scope of work, if we, depending on what the timing of, if you do go for a special town meeting, that we can revise the zoning ourselves. It's not like, you know, we can't touch it once they give it to us, so
Right.
it also could be revisions that we make ourselves after they finish their work.
Now, that raises the different issue. We're not onto it, but this is where I'm coming from on the article we have this year. Is right now, as it's recommended by the warrant committee, there's zero funded, and this is where my concern comes in. It's like, if it's zero funded, even if there is a special town meeting in the fall, you don't change the tax rates. It's like there's no way you're gonna actually, unless we're sitting there with a windfall and free cash, and we want to just allocate something, which I'm sure that by next fall, Mike will figure out how to get us that windfall. But in case he doesn't, I'm thinking we can't count on that being the
He's nodding yes.
That's his smile when you say that. My point is that I am very concerned that if we don't figure out what to do in this town meeting, we've written this year off. We'll do things administratively, and maybe we'll be really ready to hit the gate running a year from now, but I'm concerned that won't be the case.
Yeah, I shared that same concern when I heard the articles were zero funded, because the suggestion that, well, you can just fund it at the special town meeting if you go forward, but that doesn't seem like that really works financially. So to me, it was if you zero fund it, you're kicking it off a year, but it may not, it's not our committee per se, it's presumably your implementation committee.
I mean, I don't think there's any bar on appropriating funds at a special town meeting, right?
No.
There's just no funds.
Where do you get the money?
No, there's gonna be just as much funds as there are now, right? I mean, it's either gonna be,
Well,
unless
the
we're
only
talking
thing
about an
you-
override
You're
for the
talking about
hospital money.
reallocating? You're
It's
talking about
possible.
reallocating funds?
Well, I think ultimately, if we're gonna fund this, and I agree with you fundamentally, that I think I would like to be able to fund this article at this annual town meeting. We need a plan of what we're gonna do with that money. And to me, it's not more planning. And so it's gotta be a process towards disposition in October. And we can spend money on towards disposition in October. I don't think we should spend any money sort of, because we might redo the plan in response to inputs from developers, or we might engage in an additional supplemental planning process. I think that's why, in my mind, I've always thought we would appropriate the funds in the special town meeting, because to me, if the special town meeting says no, right, if they adopt the view that we don't like any of it, we don't want development, we want a dog park, essentially, right? We want a place to walk our dogs and occasionally film a movie, then we don't need money. Now, it could still sit there, right, and something could come up and it could change. But I think if we have a defined plan of what we're going to do with the money from July 1st to October 22nd. With the notion that if in the implementation, we need some additional appropriations in October, if the town endorses some direction, and if the town approves the disposition of land in October, we can supplement that as needed. What I don't agree with is having funds that are just sort of available, maybe for more planning, maybe for something that we call half planning, half implementation. That's my concern.
Well, Sarah, so let's talk brass tacks here, because I don't think you just come up with money in the fall. So I don't think that will happen unless you're
Come out of the same free cash account it would come out of this time.
No, it can't come out of free cash, because free cash disappears June 30th, and you can't appropriate from it until the new free cash is certified, which is usually November or December.
So for argument's sake,
You
stabilization.
could take it out of stabilization, or say there'd be other sources where you could take it from.
But it's not a free
But
cash,
not
okay.
free cash, yeah.
But between now and then, part of this we have to get down to brass tacks. Sarah, I think if this was funded, you were looking for 50,000 of it to basically pursue the grant that would allow us to do the infrastructure studies, to figure out, that could potentially lead to the multi-million-dollar MassWorks grants. That would be a way of offsetting the cost to the town of putting in infrastructure. If we're truly at a point where we're not sure whether we're gonna do anything with that property or at all, after 3 years of master planning, after $500,000 of coming up with a master plan that does involve development, and we are truly at a point that we're saying, well, now we have to ask the people in town whether they wanna do anything up there or not, then I agree, don't put any money in there, let the buildings fall down, we get the dog park by default. If we've been doing that, then I don't know what we've been, if that's where we are now, I don't know what we've been doing for 3 years.
Well, the reality is, we can neither sell land nor zone the property for development without a vote of town meeting.
Correct.
So it's not another survey of people, it's a town meeting.
Correct.
And so we have to get an approval for town meeting.
I'm on with all that, but my point is, if Sarah needs money now to go for a grant to get the infrastructure, but we're not sure if we're actually gonna put any infrastructure in, so therefore we're saying, don't put any money down now, I just don't know what we've been doing for 3 years. I do think that the commercial perspective, which has not really had a chance to take a run at this master plan, we have to do that before we understand what the true economics are. We may not like a lot of what that commercial perspective tells us, and then we'll have a different decision to make. Do we want to sell our souls to get this thing done, or do we not want to? But at least we'll understand the proposition. Right now, we've been working by saying, what would we like to see without enough price tags on the things that we're buying? And we have a picture, and the master plan is there, and we're having trouble closing the gap on the finances. But a piece of that is because we walked into the store without the price tags, really. When we asked what people wanted, we weren't giving them trade-offs, we were just asking them what they wanted. It's okay. It's just that disciplined business perspective of real developers has to come in. I think it will present us with some things that we'll need to change. Whether it's too many things to change or not, I don't know.
Right. And so and you've been to these meetings, so you know more than I do what the committee's done. I'm sort of coming to the perspective, I think the committee has gotten a lot of input from commercial developers.
I would disagree.
In the sense that VHB told us what commercial developers want to build is lots of houses. McCabe has told us what commercial developers want to build is lots of houses. And McCabe has told us, I believe, that even in our preferred scenario, we've included more commercial development than she thinks is sustainable for where we are. Now, I'm happy to get more advice, and I agree with you 100% on that. I'm sort of skipping ahead saying, if the commercial developers come up with sort of a magic bullet that everybody loves, that's great. I suspect that what we're gonna get back is that they're still gonna say the location is 20 minutes from the highway, it's not by a train, it's in a town of 12,000 people. Trend for development is moving closer to the city, not further away, and what they really like to build is a lot of houses. And so, I mean, I think that's likely gonna still be where we are. If it's wrong, that's great. And so I wanna get that, and to the extent the committee has not done any research and has not gotten inputs from commercial developers, we should, and that's an absolute necessity. I just think we're probably gonna end up back in the same situation where we're gonna say, well, we'd like to build a lot of houses. And that's what's most economical there.
So my point is that if, you may be right, you may be wrong, I'm not
Those are the
convinced
two
that
options.
anybody really knows. No, well, or we could take another 3 years and not make a decision, but.
No, I'm against that.
Pete,
Now, I'm
so,
sort of
but
resigned to
my
it.
only point on the funding is, there's half of that, I mean, when we had tossed the number around, we tossed 100,000 around. Half of that, I think, is what Sarah is looking for. So that's a piece that, unless you don't even wanna get prepared to put in infrastructure up there, to me, that just makes sense. The other half is you create this new committee, you ask this committee to go out and start having these conversations with developers. I can picture that committee needing to actually spend some money, either for a consultant or for special studies, as opposed to, we're just volunteers and we're gonna send out letters and the town picks up the postage and then people come in and talk to us. It's just to give them something to work with between now and the fall to keep this thing going. So.
And I generally agree with that, if we have an agreement on what that committee's gonna do.
Mhm.
In other words,
Yeah.
that, here's what they're gonna do, here's what the composition's gonna be, these are the deadlines, and we're working towards land disposition at the same town meeting in October.
So as a practical matter, though, we probably will be making a decision about the funding in 2 weeks, and we won't agree on what this committee needs to do until by the end of the fiscal year.
I mean, I would be, well, I think we can agree on what the committee needs to do sooner than that.
I'm not sure if we can agree before town meeting.
Well,
I hope we can do it sooner than
I mean,
that.
I think if we can agree on enough that it would be a useful exercise as opposed to, you know, a perpetual discussion, then I would be comfortable saying, you know, it's worth having the money there. And if it turns out that the town meeting rejects the plan, we don't have to spend the money. It's just the
Yeah.
money that's appropriated and unspent.
Yep.
And we're better off being in that position than we are being in a position of having stuff to do, nothing to do with. So I agree with you on that front. I just don't, and the concern I had when I saw your email today, Steve, is that it did seem like a long period of time to a finished product if we're shooting towards October. And so it counts on us doing a lot of stuff in July and August, that I don't know if we can do that much. And so it may just be that's the only timetable we have, and we've just gotta try to live with it. But I don't think we can let anything drift past October. And so we're gonna kinda have to fish or cut bait now to get the process in place to move in that direction. And I think as part of this process, we can get whatever additional commercial developer inputs you wanna get so that we're comfortable that we've got that perspective. I don't think anybody is gonna say we can redevelop the entire site, with a modest amount of money and a modest amount of development.
One of the reasons maybe I'm a little more relaxed about some of this than maybe you are is that the committee has discussed phasing. And phasing takes a lot of, to me, part of this is the campus is a huge omelet that we want to cook. And everybody's afraid to break the first egg. So I'm actually more of a mind that says, I'm willing to, if a developer came in and said, here's this big thing, I don't know how you're gonna do everything everywhere with all of it, but here's something that's an opportunity that I think is a near-term opportunity. I could see us not trying to come up with disposition for the entire site. That's one way we may back into phasing, just as a practical matter. I can see phasing, certainly from a market absorption, depending on what you do with the site, I can see phasing making sense from a market absorption standpoint. I can also see phasing make sense when we take a look at that full project from a town finance standpoint that says we need to set up outflows, the investments the town makes to get certain things done, to set up the inflows coming in from that piece, so the town never takes the deep dive and puts in the investment for the entire place for 10 years and then digs out. So that I can, when it comes to phasing, I can see phasing making sense on a whole bunch of different ways. But one of them might literally be just cracking the first egg of the omelet.
Right. And that is certainly my view, because I think we can sell a good chunk of the front part of the property for affordable housing and have a comprehensive permit issued there by May of 2020.
And I will feel so much better when a professional developer
That's right.
tells us that that's the thing to do.
That's fine. I bet you they will say, you know what, the easiest place to build is closer to the road, closer to utilities, and what people want to build is housing. But if they tell us they want to do something else, that's fine.
If we have a developer that can see the full value, we're in agreement because we agreed the zoning should be flexible to handle all this stuff. So we're not really arguing, other than that neither one of us is qualified to say what we should do with that land. And we both love to lapse into that. But, okay.
Well, I like the way that Steve presented it as a way forward. I think that we absolutely need the money for this coming year, because if we don't have that, I think it's gonna just hamstring the process. So I think it's important to set aside money for the planning, get Sarah going on her grant.
I mean, is the presumption of that grant, Sarah, that we're gonna redevelop the whole property? Something along the lines of the preferred scenario in the master plan?
It would analyze the capacity yes, I think ultimate presumption is the capacity would accommodate the full build-out. And that would, so the grant would be for 25% design drawings in order to have enough substantial engineering to get us in a better position to unlock more infrastructure grants.
But Sarah, would it be fair to say that's, if I think of this campus, the footprint of, that study does not actually get heavily influenced by whether or not we're restoring everything there. It's got to do with, the road network is the road network, and we're not planning to change that. And the footprint of the buildings right now is fundamentally the extent of the development that this infrastructure would be geared to support.
I think it's the capacity for the number of units and the type of uses that are being proposed, not the layout of the, necessarily. I think the presumption is that we're reusing buildings in the master plan, but it's very possible that there would be some demolition or renovation, additions that would connect.
Okay, comments, questions? Martha, you're gonna go first this time. I only skipped over you before because I knew your name and I couldn't say I'm gonna skip over you.
There you go. So it sounds to me like, this is leaning towards, thinking towards putting money to do the grant for the infrastructure and whatnot. Making sure that we have the option to proceed the way the master plan is kind of envisioned at this point. What I want to point out is that that also involves professional help. And it's between about $500,000 a year, unless we as individual volunteers are going to become the professionals that manage this whole process. So I'd like to just don't forget that piece, that we need to make sure we know how we're going to manage the process and that we account for that as well.
At the point that we're developing the properties.
At the point
Yeah.
that we're developing the properties, or is there upfront? I mean, there have been talk about needing those resources immediately. Obviously, they're not going to come immediately, but.
Well, for instance, preparing RFPs, I mean, unless you have a highly functioning committee with a lot of time on their hand, RFPs are time consuming to prepare. So if you think you're gonna start, preparing disposition RFPs without a consultant, that's gonna be, I mean, maybe somebody can do it, but that's a pretty big undertaking for volunteers.
Yeah, I'm certainly not thinking we're gonna do our disposition RFPs with volunteers. I'm pretty sure we're not gonna spend $500,000 a year to implement a plan. And if the plan takes $500,000 a year to implement, we need a new plan. Unless it's gonna throw off $10 million of commercial tax revenue at the
Well,
end.
I think it's not this plan, but I think that the consultants were throwing out numbers about if you really wanted to monitor this plan or any other plan, so that you're making sure that the developer's doing what you want, that you may need certain staff resource commitments. I mean, I think 500,000 is a pretty high number, but it should be looked at and thought through as far as what kind of staffing, what kind of legal help you might need, whatever, in order to just be a responsible owner, because we do own it, and you want to, unless you want to throw in the keys and have at it, you're going to want to monitor it, so you may need assistance in that effort as well. Yeah,
But we also do have zoning laws that, most things get built in town without the town hiring someone to monitor it beyond a town planner and a building commissioner and that sort of thing.
Yeah, but I think Steve said, if this is merely a land disposition and a sale, and as you said, throw the keys to somebody, then you're right. But to the extent this is, I know McCabe had brought up in some of the meetings the concept of a public-private partnership, which basically what we're saying is if you want this land to be developed in a way that is not the straightforward, optimal way a private real estate developer would develop it to haul in a big profit. If you have some other purpose for it, and you want to rate that back to something that's less than the full potential financial benefit of this project, you're probably going to have to stay involved in one way or another to build the relationship and to be able to retain the kind of control that you're trying to keep it to be this public-private partnership.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there was a huge amount of input from the public about not doing throw the keys to a developer. That's not to say that's not what you want to propose. If you want to propose it, that's fine. But I think you'll get a lot of resistance from a lot of people who say, why did we bother with all this effort if all you're just going to do is throw it to somebody and say, do whatever you want? So I think that
It costs us $25 million to do it otherwise.
well, it may cost you that either way. I mean, the economics are that if you look at the VHB approach and you want a developer to pay for it, you're looking at 600 units. So if you're willing to propose that to the town, then that's fine. I would doubt seriously that would pass in any town meeting. So, but that's your prerogative. But if you want to do something scaled down, then it involves some kind of cost sharing with the town. That is implicit in the approach we have. So, I mean, that's a fundamental decision. But if you feel like you want to keep some of the open access there, you want to keep some public access, some public amenities, that to me entails a certain stewardship on the town's side to make sure that those are preserved. So that's a value judgment to be made. And I don't think that's a 25 million or zero. I think we're talking here about staff commitment or consultant commitment or whatever to monitor a process, as opposed to the bigger decision, which is are we willing to foot the bill for a bunch of infrastructure. That's a much bigger discussion.
And the other way to do it would be to take it a step at a time and not make a $25 million, $500 million decision now, but do what you can and get the professional input from commercial developers saying, what are the two pieces of property you would develop first? And we have get input from John Thompson. How long do you think the buildings would stand? What does it cost to maintain the buildings? 'Cause we don't have it, we're not required to either tear the buildings down or redevelop the entirety of the property.
Yeah, and I don't think there's an imminent threat that any of them are going to fall down.
Right. So I think development and the buildings can coexist for some period of time, and the market will change, opportunities will change, the options that are open to us will change at that point. And so I don't think the choice is between 600 houses or tearing all the buildings down or paying $500,000 a year to staff up to oversee the exact implementation of where things are going to go. I think there's a different way to go about this. I don't have the answer as to what it is, but I think if we treated it more like 94 acres and less like this is something that has to hang together coherently altogether forever, I think we'd have more options in the long run. And this is not to say that the preferred scenario is not one way it could go. There are other ways it could go too that could achieve in the short term some additional town goals that people, again, also said in response to the surveys they'd like to see done, that we certainly hear a lot from people saying, well, you've got 94 acres up there, why are you putting in all these housing developments in narrower locations when you have all this space? And I think, we have some identified housing goals that we'd like to achieve that can be achieved up there, probably without prejudice to the long-term redevelopment of the property. Jack.
Do I need to identify myself?
I've got it.
Well,
No.
based on your statements earlier, someone might remind
You've
you.
forgotten?
You are Jack Wolf from Medfield and of the Water Committee.
But
The reason I'm asking is because I
Somebody
had
ran for vice
forgotten.
president, start his speech off like this.
have you given us your complete medical history?
I'm going to get more frequent flyer miles than I on ALS than you, Mike. Okay.
I'm just amazed to see you advocating for the expensive
I know.
option.
That's where we thought the dementia came in. Who's that man?
I never pleaded sanity. To me, the earlier discussion that you guys had was really interesting. It seems to me that there's sort of 3 points that you've talked about, and Mike, you've written some notes on that I think are a useful thing to think about. One piece is, let's go out and get some developer input. Let's test this plan against the real world and see what developers might say. Real-world input is needed. The second piece on that is let's look from that at what a phasing and implementation might be. Are there some chunks that can be sensibly cut off early on, disposed of, built, so that we can get started on this to the point you made, Gus, okay? And the third piece I would offer as a caution. Mass Historical, we have an agreement with Mass Historical. I'm not sure I know what restrictions or opportunities are present in that agreement. I think it'd be great if we had professional look at that agreement and try to understand just what's in there for a restriction for us or alternately for an opportunity. I think one of the big things that's happening that has completely raised the cost of this and caused the financials to be unattractive, at least in a major scenario in it, is the fact that we have so much refurbishment going on up there and so little new building.
Could I just react to, and I'd invite you to react to that, Steve. My sense of that increased refurbishment is that it was driven by Kathy McCabe's knowledge of historic tax credits that actually brought us in a direction that she was suggesting was one of the most financially attractive or financially viable ways to redevelop it. So it's, I struggle a little bit even with the committee, having gone to so many meetings where a year ago the issue was how many of these buildings are worth saving, and the assumption was a lot of them were coming down until I think it was Doug Brown was the guy's name, who came and looked at the buildings and said, no, we've restored worse buildings than this. And there was a subtle shift in my perception is there was a subtle shift in the thinking that occurred then when suddenly it's like, well, if we can preserve it all, then the conversations were all around preserving it all. And so I've wrestled with that same thing you're calling out, Jack, because I hear Kathy talk about the historic tax credits, and if you get rid of some of it, you ruin the integrity of and therefore you're not eligible for the same. And I honestly can't figure out whether she has painted the absolute best picture that we can financially present, short of just taking the buildings down and then selling the land, or whether we've gone to where the priority of historic preservation has bumped up a few notches, and now that's so close to driving the train that we're trying to fit everything else under it. And Steve, the reason I invite, because it's a real, back of that mind impression that's emerged for me over about a year that's given me some concern about that. You may have a different perspective.
Well, I guess I have a few things to say. I mean, I keep coming back to the point that the Mass Historic Memorandum obligates us to consider historic preservation and to at least create a level playing field. Encourages us to be even more proactive and try to save the buildings. But, as I've said, I don't believe that any RFP should say these buildings have to be saved, and I've made that point repeatedly, although it doesn't seem like anybody ever hears it or remembers it. So the point being, we laid out a format that we think here's the acceptable area of development, and here are the footprints of these buildings in this kind of campus layout. If a developer comes in and says, I'll give you $1 million and I'll save all the buildings, somebody else comes in and says, I'll give you $10 million, but I'm going to tear them all down. That's a decision we have to make. What is it worth to save them? But we are not saying you have to save the buildings. That's not part of the package that we're proposing. So I just think that that's just a wrong way to look at it, because I think there's a big expense to tearing all those buildings down as well. So, and once you tear them down, any assistance you could get with historic credits disappears. So, I think it's going to be the development community that dictates it. But I'll tell you that when we had our roundtable, we had a lot of we had some developers who would have cleared everything and done a gated community, and they were very interested because it's a huge piece of land. They could build a nice gated community. Most of the people in the public hated that because they thought, it's somehow this should be more open to the town. Other developers were historic credit developers who I've encountered a lot in my practice, and they have called me repeatedly saying, what are you guys doing? When are you going to come out with the RFP? What's going on? So the idea that the developers that will clear it and do it have more of an interest or will pay more, to me is a questionable proposal. So, I think there is a lot of interest among developers who this is their industry. They restore buildings like this, and I think the turning point Gus, was as much the tour we all took to Lowell, where we saw some of the before and after pictures, and I think Gene had organized that for a number of the committee members. And, you know, I'd seen that myself, but, you know, most people hadn't. And when they did see that, it sort of opened their eyes to the fact that buildings in a lot worse shape than these get restored all the time. So it's not like, oh, these buildings are terrible, they have to be torn down. That's the attitude of a lot of people look at them because, you know, they look pretty sorry right now. But they're really great candidates for restoration. And when you take advantage of the credits, you know, maybe an economic proposition, but we are not locked into saving the buildings, and that is not what's driving the price of the plan. So I just want to make that clear.
Steve, would it be fair in your answer to say that while Kathy has been helpful to this committee to understand the full implications of historic tax credits and even low income affordable housing credits, we could expect that the developers who are capable of developing this scale of property would be equally knowledgeable, and whatever decisions they would make, they would be properly, or at least reasonably, considering those in the balance on what they would do with the property.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it depends on who you ask to bid. I mean, but certainly on the list that I would recommend would be a number of developers who do this all the time. So I appreciate Kathy's expertise, but they do these projects all the time. So I would say their level of expertise is higher than hers. So.
Steve, are those developers that would do the whole site too? They're capable of doing the whole site?
Absolutely. And a lot of them want the whole site in part because the issue that you alluded to, Gus, which is part of the historic significance of this site is the campus layout. And so that's a difficult decision because if you buy the entire site and tear down half the buildings, then the Park Service may deny you the credits on the balance of the buildings because you've destroyed that historic significance. So that's something developers are going to have to figure out. But it argues for disposition of the whole core campus to a developer because they can have the security of knowing that they can do it sensitively and make sure they preserve their credits. I'm not saying that's how you have to do it, but that is one factor to think about in your disposition plan. So.
I think Jerry is next.
He answered much better than I would have.
Oh.
He actually knew what he was talking about. I just, I'm not even dementia, I just not that smart.
All right, Gil.
Gil Rogers, 283 North Street. I'm not going to say anything new because I've said this so many times, but I think one of the things that we did that was very smart was to do our catalyst meetings. And we probably have had, I don't know, 30 plus meetings. And a number of those were with companies that specialize in restoring mills and older buildings. And I think the feedback that we received from all of them, first of all, they have a lot of expertise in using historical tax credits. And they know the procedure, they know when it's applicable, they know how to get it, they know the timing of it, that type of thing. And I think that they gave us quite a bit of confidence, you know, that the idea of restoring buildings and putting them into uses that's appropriate for today was very feasible. And I think at Lowell, I had the same impression. I don't know if you've been to Lowell recently, but you know, there were old mill buildings with the roofs collapsing and the walls falling down. You know, so they were in really bad shape, much worse than we have up at the hospital. And we talked to maybe one or two developers that were involved in that process. And they gave the same sort of confidence. You know, if you're using construction methods and you're using historical tax credit, you can take buildings and put them into commercial, retail space. It was very eye-opening, I think, for everybody on the committee to spend a day meeting with people, meeting with some of the developers up there, walking around and actually seeing what could be done with it, because it's miraculous what's been done. It takes a vision, you know, that's one thing that's very important. It takes a vision and it takes strong advocacy. A very strong statement from the community is this is what we want to see. And that seemed to be a very key part of the ingredient of why that became successful. So we have had quite a bit of input. You know, you always can ask for more. It's always tricky of how you ask for more, though. And that's one comment, because if you go out and ask developers, okay, first of all, which we tried, all right, first of all, they're going to be reluctant to say very much. Also, they have to worry about compromising their position. That is to say that they don't want to have a conflict of interest or an implied conflict of interest because they came in and they talked to you, or they gave a presentation or something like that, particularly if they want to be an active part in it. An RFI that is sort of one way of trying to do that. The question is how effective an RFI is. I mean, you can send an RFI out and get either very poor responses to it, you get 1 or 2 or 3 sort of things, so you don't really learn that much from it. Or that the RFI isn't taken seriously. That if a company is going to try to put real horsepower and intelligence into doing it, they're not going to spend lots of money if they don't know if it's really for real. So you have to, while it sounds kind of good, when you get into the details of how you get that input, how you get developer input, or how you get that kind of concrete, advice from the real world, you have to think about how you're actually going to do that and how effective it is. And my last point is just the point that I think, and I've felt this very strongly since the beginning, is it's a very big, complicated site up there. And to try to do this all at once is, I think, beyond imagination. So that the concept, I think, of phasing has all sorts of benefits to it. It has the financial benefits that you're talking about, where you're getting income that's going to help you as you build it. It gives you market exposure, so you're learning from the market as you bite off a piece of it and it becomes successful. And then this point that I tried to make last time is as we create an anchor part of it, and as I say, I think that it's the front section and the cultural corner, that type of thing, it increases the value of the other parts of the property. So it's not fixed. It's a very dynamic thing that you're doing. So phasing, I think, has just a lot of, sense to it, and I highly suggest that we implement that part of it.
So I don't know about you, I don't have any doubt that you can restore buildings and old buildings. I mean, Lowell's a city with highways and trains, and I think, and if you have examples of other sites that have been done like this that are similarly located, I know I've made this request before, but I'd be happy, I'd love to see that. I mean, my skepticism about a $500 million project where it is a lot to do with the location of it. And again, I'm happy to be told by a developer that I'm wrong, but I'm just trying to think about this from a, you run through the financial scenario, and even with a substantial public investment, it's still a dicey proposition. And I don't think that's because you haven't gotten the right input or you haven't done enough research. I just think it's a dicey proposition to have a development of this size in a town like Medfield, right? I think there's a reason that the feedback has always been, we want to build housing there, right? And because that's what people want to build in Medfield. And to the extent we hear this otherwise, with respect to commercial development in town, most people, where they want to be on 27, or they want to be on 109. And you're constantly saying to people, what about the hospital? Well, we want to be at 107, not 27 or 109, for obvious reasons. And that's not to say, it couldn't work, but I'm just thinking about realistically. It would be great if the answer from developers is, oh yeah, we would love to put $500 million into that and do all this other stuff. I just think, given the information the committee's already gathered, and that I'm just skeptical that's what we're going to get. And so I think we kind of need a backup plan, in the sense that if we don't have interest in doing this, putting aside the $25 million, because I don't see how we justify putting $25 million into a redevelopment like this. I mean, that's just, with all the financial needs that we have, I mean, even if the real cost of tearing down the buildings is $25 million, if you tore down the buildings, it's probably not, but if it is, you tear it down for $25 million, you zone it RS, you have a piece of property that's worth many times what you paid to tear down the buildings, just from a financial risk perspective. I don't want to do that either, so I'm not advocating for the VHP proposal, but I think that we do need a backup plan, and in the phasing process, there's got to be a way to phase it that doesn't require you to get all the way to the end. In other words, the phasing has to admit of the possibility that there's going to be some projects, and then the appetite of the market to do more projects. Putting aside, I think if we can dispose it to one developer who would implement the preferred scenario, I could certainly get behind that, putting aside the $25 million for But in the event that we don't, I think there's gotta be some way forward here that doesn't require us to hit a home run to have that be a successful operation. And I think ultimately, whatever is not developed is gonna be for the town, right? So I mean, if you did it and you only got 3 projects in, you got 3 things in, and whatever happens on the cultural side, you might have a nice setup up there, but then the rest of it will be, you know, for something in the future, and 15 years from now, the situation could be different. So,
I think the other point is that we have lots of cost assumptions about it. For example, the 25 million thing that's kicked around all the time. Those are all assumptions. Now, they're done by C&D, a reputable construction company. But if you think of phasing the infrastructure just as much as phasing the development, and taking a bite of it, right? So not building the whole system, but building the first phase of it, then we'll learn more about what the costs really are, how expensive it is to do renovations, to do cleanup, to put in infrastructure. So the phasing concept teaches us more about uncertainty. It helps reduce the uncertainty. And so then we can look to see, you know, is the 25 million too high or is it too low? But, you know, as opposed to, you think of it just as an assumption with a huge variance around it. It could be, you know, way off.
Well, part of me, you kind of have to look at this whole, you try to look at it in the big picture. Part of it is, if it is I've been using 20 million in my head just because it's a nice round number, that's a lump that the town right now, it's like it's lining up for them. But to me, that's part of why getting Sarah the 50,000 to get the grant to set up at least potentially a Mass Works funding that starts chipping away at that $1 million makes sense. But in order to make that happen, that's a multi-year effort, and we're at the crossroads where we either start going down that path or we choose to sit at the crossroads for 3 years, and then when we finally decide, gee, we do want infrastructure, too bad we don't have 3 years to work our way through the grant process, I guess we'll have to come up with the money. That's the piece that bothers me. You know, I'm thinking, Steve, your point around these developers, it's like, I bet you we'd have a lot more pleasant conversations with these developers if we had that $25 million infrastructure problem figured out, and we were having, what would you like to do with this property that has this skeleton infrastructure in place? I bet it would be a lot more fun to have conversations with those sides if we could do that.
Bill?
Well, you know, I've always argued for flexibility. And that's the thing about the one-time project that's always bothered me. I mean, it's market conditions change. You're looking at, what, a 10 or 11 or 12-year build-out, assuming that the market absorption rates are correct and something doesn't happen with the marketplace or whatever. And then I just picture us getting pretty much stuck into something that's sitting there either as a hole in the ground or is turned into something else that the developer would say later on, I can't do it for what I said I could do it for. I need XYZ plus or whatever. I need to change the project. I wanted to get back to Sarah's grant. One of the things that had been talked about at one time in a phased development was just putting in the infrastructure up for the front half of the property and then leaving, I think they called it a stub or something, for the rest of the property. If I understood what Sarah was saying about what the grant was for, the issue there, of course, is you need to have some kind of an idea of what the stub is going to have to handle in the second or third or fourth phase. And so I was going to ask the question of how sure are we that $50,000 is the right number to get something that would satisfy, you know, a phased kind of approach.
I can't guarantee that every answer is, every question is going to be answered. The quote did come from Parr and McCabe, who have familiarity with the project and the process. So it's the best I can do at this point.
And of course, with a grant, I always ask the question about what strings come with it or anything else, or any
Well,
clawbacks
this
or
one
anything else.
is a $100,000 grant with no string. You have to have match it, right? So it's 10% match, cash match, and this exceeds the 100,000. So that's why I'm looking for so much match. But it's an affordable housing, called Planning for Housing Production. So there's a affordable component to the grant. It's part of the governor's housing choice initiative. As you know, they're looking for many housing units produced throughout the state, affordable and market rate. So that is in line with that. And it's meant to unlock barriers to the production of housing. The infrastructure certainly is.
In a way, but that's not a barrier, that's more of a financial issue for a developer. I mean, it's always been an $18 to $20 million problem for somebody. And it was going to be a problem for DCAM, $18 to $20 million as well. And of course, the same fears were there. What happens once you start the development? Where does it wind up? Is 400 units enough? Does it become 500? Does it become 600 or whatever? I wanted to point out there are other costs that are going to be associated with whatever the development, the fuller, more complete development will lead to, and those are issues about not just the infrastructure you need to get from Hospital Road back into the property, but the infrastructure you need to get from the property to the waste treatment station. Or so there's some questions that are not yet answered there. There are also, or if you look at the MEPA report that was done for 440 units, there are several traffic interchanges that are going to need to be redesigned and everything else. I'm sure ultimately, if they had done the project that they were going to do, DCAM had done the project that they had proposed and had been legislated, that would have been part of the negotiations with the developer to make those traffic improvements. But I mean, those are things that have not gone into the current estimates of what the infrastructure costs are. I mean, we're talking about the developer's infrastructure costs or someone to get the infrastructure into the property. We're not talking about the costs to the rest of the town, treatment facility, to water supply, whatever, what have you. So those things will have to be in there as well. I would again suggest that perhaps some thought should go into how would you get this grant for a phased project as opposed to the one that's currently described. I mean, it's to leave your options open for, you know, not spending the money fruitlessly or for no good purpose. But the stub access makes a lot of sense, at least to begin with, in a phased development program.
So this is the
You want to just take the microphone, Sarah?
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Sorry, not using it. There's no guarantee we'll get the grant, but I was very clear in the grant application that we have a draft master plan. It's not accepted. It's not endorsed by the town. There's no zoning attached to it. So if we get it, I think it'd be great for implementing in the future. But
so you could do I assume we could do it parallel. I mean, it's, it wouldn't affect the grant necessarily. I'd be more concerned about that we design something that can be useful, in any circumstance.
I just want to add too that in my conversations with Joanna Hilford, she's had experience in Walpole working on a project with MassWorks infrastructure grants where the town and the developer partnered, and one of the agreements in that partnership was that the developer was responsible for anything that went beyond a certain amount that's covered by the MassWorks infrastructure grant. So there's a lot of options when you get there.
Sarah, just a quick question. What's the total size of the grant that we could get?
$100,000. And I've never seen a grant amount that much, Christine.
That doesn't lead to a larger amount if they get that?
For this grant round, this planning for housing production round, that's the maximum award.
Where can we go up?
Oh, with the MassWorks infrastructure grants? Projects around the Commonwealth have varied somewhere between, $750,000 for some sort of design to multiple millions. Larger cities might have been like
25 million?
I think that last year, 15, 20 million were awarded to larger cities. But on the MassWorks infrastructure grant website, they actually list all the projects and their scopes and the award amounts. Yeah.
I'll take a look. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, we have to compete presumably with, or we will have to compete with other towns.
Other projects.
Who may have higher percentages of affordability. So, I mean, those are all things. I'm not talking against it. I mean.
No, all these things that I work on go into, planning and the additional points that you get for having certain plans and features all go into that. I think there was one more thing that I was going to mention. This escaped me, so if I think of it, we're dementia with Jack.
So tying back to what we need to address in the short term. So if we were to push for $100,000 from Medfield State Hospital at the annual town meeting, 50,000 would go towards this Mass Work grant application, and then 50,000 towards drafting land acquisition RFPs.
I would just, without
Well,
any,
there's
without,
something else. I mean,
I would say would go toward the development efforts being picked up to move toward. I think it's appropriate to say that the expectation is it will lead to land disposition RFPs, but just putting it that way sounds like we have a plan and it's just an administrative drill to get to disposition RFPs, and that loses this whole thing about bringing the private development picture into.
Okay, so it could be.
I'm not suggesting we just plan, another year of planning. It's just that there's a piece of this that takes what we have and actually gets it to the point where we actually know what we're gonna do.
Right.
That stands up economically as well as conceptually. And that's the piece that I don't know what that other 50,000 is best.
I mean, the problem is that the consultation with the development community can easily become another master planning process. In the sense that if the input from the development community is, you should do a different master plan, or we want to see a different set of zoning, are we then gonna have to go through the same
I mean, that's, I
exercise?
think, why you want the people on this committee to be also skilled real estate developers who have an understanding of what the town's trying to accomplish, because I don't think you'll let the conversation go in that direction to, let's just pretend you don't have a plan, let's start from scratch. That would be an unresponsive developer.
Right, although we won't really know what the town's position is until the town meeting in October. I mean,
I think we're a little smarter than that, but. Yeah, I think the price tag will influence the town's position for sure, but I don't think we don't have any idea of what the town thought it was buying, what it wanted, what it continues to want. The picture has been very consistent for 4 years, 3 years, 3 years.
We never told the town what their desires cost.
That's the issue, yeah.
right, so I mean, I think, my view is that people have expressed a lot of preferences. I think people in town are pretty practical. And I think with the practical considerations laid out there, I think there is a wide range of possibilities, if they are financially feasible, that will be acceptable to the town meeting. And so I don't consider us locked in to the survey results as they've come back. They had whatever utility they had, but I think at this point, they're not even, they're a moderate data point at best. And, what is important now is what's in the best interest of the town, which plan is going to work best for the town, and to the point you've made repeatedly, which is a correct one, which is going to achieve some town goals in the process. Jerry.
Jerry Potts, 7 Curve Street. So I guess where I always get stuck on this is, and I sort of in supporting Gus on this, I think the one area that seems to be pretty clear is 600 units, 500 to 600 units, whether that was DCAM or VHB, we ran away from. The economics are pretty easy. You do that, you make money. So if the town, if it was making money, well, the 600, I'm just saying from the standpoint of what the developers.
Depends on the Monte Carlo analysis.
I'm saying residential housing, pop a bunch of houses. The developers certainly pushed for that. VHB said that that's what they're gonna. All I'm saying on this is the plan that is in front of you today to consider is a range of options, even with the zoning the way it is. There's some commercial, there's some assisted living, there's some residential. I don't think we're locking into anything on this plan other than a framework to enter into negotiations with intelligence. So to go to developers and say, these are the general framework and guidelines, but the zoning itself is fairly broad, and the range of options available, there's 90,000 square feet in commercial. Now, McCabe thinks there's no way you're gonna fill it, but if you got someone, there's 90,000 square feet of commercial development if you want it. Like you said, good luck getting there, but you've got more than enough residential, so the mixed use, the open space, it's all there. So I don't feel like the master plan locks us into some draconian, it gives us a good framework to go out to the real world and and get real information. And, you know, I think we're all sitting here saying the same thing. We want to activate it as soon as possible and act on it. But I don't think the work that's been done, whether, you know, again, the rumors are, oh, it's historic tax credits and they want to keep all the buildings. No, it's a bunch of educated assumptions that once we go to the real world, it's a wood chipper. You know, it's gonna hit reality, and we're gonna figure out what the market can really bear. And waiting another 18 months or 2 years doesn't give us more information.
I agree, and I think the only the only issue with that is, and I think I'm 100% in agreement with that, as long as 100% of the land is zoned for development. In other words, that it's not just the footprint of the preferred scenario that's zoned for development. That's what would give us flexibility to find out and actually implement something once the zoning is passed. And so my concern is not over the master plan, it is over that we're gonna get zoning, which is gonna become law, that requires 2/3 of town meeting, and if that's what we've passed, then it only covers 45 acres of the property. And I agree, within the footprint that's been created, there's a lot of flexibility. The problem is that if anyone wants to go beyond that footprint, we'd have to change the zoning. And so I think in the input from developers, I mean, I don't see why we would zone any of the property as off limits for development. I don't, you know,
because it's
I
a
think
balance of what the community said with some open space and the areas that are open today. Why would you give those up and then keep this? So in other words,
you would give those up. You would potentially build where it's easiest to build and cheapest to build, which is closer to Hospital Road where there's no land. Potentially. Now again, developers may say something else, and I'm not locked into this. I just don't know why we would lock ourselves into the current footprint when maybe you can get the open space where there are currently buildings that are unprofitable to develop. That maybe instead of refurbishing those buildings, maybe you'd have open space there. I think ultimately, if we do this in phasing, 50 years from now, it won't all be developed. Unless there's a train line comes through the town or there's some significant demographic change, I just think it's unlikely. It may happen, it'd be great if it did.
So for the record, I do believe the Sledding Hill is one place that we don't want to zone for development.
Well, I don't even consider the Sledding Hill part of this.
Okay.
The same way I don't consider Lot 3 and Hinkley part of this. Those are off.
But the rest of the land you're talking about, within at least some limits, I can see us zoning it without ever having a plan to actually dispose of some of it. And so I agree with your point about there's no reason why we should restrict ourselves from a zoning standpoint or a conservation land standpoint. But that doesn't mean that there's a for sale sign, you know, that runs a quarter mile on Hospital Road, pick your lot.
No, I agree, but this is kind of the procedural problem, which is that if McCabe is gonna come back with zoning on May 9th, I think it's only gonna be zoning the area in the preferred scenario where it says development. Then if we come back and Pia, I think you were in agreement on this point as well, that we think there should be more flexibility, we're then gonna have to go back to them and say, no, you've gotta expand this, so there's the possibility of additional development. Now, you could always do any of it through a comprehensive permit, and we're gonna have the senior housing overlay district, and that can be just dropped on top of the 94 acres, and so you'd have those two options. But anything else beyond that, you would need some other kind of zoning change. And that's where I'm concerned from the standpoint of implementation and phasing, that the zoning is the big piece of this. I mean, 2/3 of town meeting, and once you've zoned it, it's hard to rezone.
I have a question. So you know, I've looked at open space, and I've looked at both the Mass Historic Agreement, I've looked at the MEPA certificate and everything else. The MEPA certificate encourages open space. The DCAM plan had open space. The MEPA certificate encourages open space. That's not to say that the next developer or whatever doesn't go back and say, I want to build on this open space or whatever, and here's my new environmental impact report, and maybe I'm going to take down 6 buildings and create 7 acres to make up for the land that I'm going to take from the current open space or the open space that's in the MEPA certificate. But it would seem to me that the optimal way to handle some of the open space, which is already on the historic register, is to treat it like you treat the buildings, which basically say, do you want to use these buildings? Do you want to, this is what we envision this as open space, you know, however, if we encourage you to use open space, MEPA certificate encourages use open space, take this into consideration in your plan or whatever, and then somebody comes back and says, no, I need 6 of those 12 acres or whatever, then you do whatever you need to do. Now, I don't know about the zoning, how you zone for open space. Is there a zoning code for open space in Medfield, or is?
As I understand it, it just won't be zoned, right?
That's not how it would be approached.
Zoned as open space?
Which you can change. I mean, I don't understand what the issue, is about going back and changing the zonings. A conservation restriction I would have a problem with because you're never gonna change it. It's gonna take forever, and now you've locked future generations out of the use of that property. But to keep the options open, I see no problem in identifying a plan that calls for open space, and then let somebody come back with a bid and say, no, I don't want open space here, I wanna put it over here, or yeah, I need some of this, or I don't need some of this other open space, or whatever. That, to me, again, I'm always arguing for flexibility and not a commitment that locks us into something that we can't ever get out of.
But the problem is if you zone it open space to start, and then you go to the disposition process, and the answer you get back is, no, we need more, then you've gotta go back, unless you're doing it through a comprehensive permit or doing it through the overlay district, you gotta go back then to another town meeting to get the zoning changed.
Under an overlay district, can you do overlay with open space?
Typically, if there was particular land that for some particular purpose you wanted to protect, you would probably do it under a conservation restriction as opposed to a zoning mechanism. The zoning, when you're talking open space, is typically done, in my experience, as a flexible floating thing. It's a percentage of a project. However the project's defined, different projects have different amounts of open space, or it's a function of how much impervious coverage or a combination of all those kinds of things. So it is flexible, as Bill suggested. You don't typically delineate an area and say, this is open space, nothing goes here. And Mike raised the issue as well. If you did that, you probably would be inadvertently creating Chapter 90 land that you'd really be restricted, so.
You would zone it, so it could be used for either.
Microphone, please, Jack.
Or open space.
Get Jack a microphone
You would have a variety of uses, projects, what have you, in a particular defined area, and basically everything floats, and then there are certain formulas and percentages that have to be applied, and generally even provision for waiver or offsets or what have you.
Understood, but within the formulae that are chosen in there, you would have flexibility of building here, open space here, building there, not having open space, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that's the purpose. Your master plan is kind of the conceptual, this is what we've done, this is how we look. The zoning should be consistent with the master plan, but provide more flexibility, so that if somebody wanted to move stuff around within limits, they'd be able to do that.
One more vote for flexible zoning. Bill.
So I think, Peter, you in agreement on $100,000 for this article at town meeting?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes? All right, so we're agreeing on $100,000. I think we have more work to do on defining the process and everything else, and I think we'll have to keep talking about that.
What about warrant, Article 18, 25?
25,000? Well, you've already won on that, Gene, so we're already in favor of that. If you'd like us to reconsider, we can reconsider.
Could I ask the hard question?
No.
Where's the money coming from?
That's your hard question. You're the town administrator.
Mike, why don't you figure that out, and then we'll let us know? No, look, I think
Can I comment on this?
Okay, out of the selectmen's salaries.
That'll cover about the first line of the grant application.
So last Thursday night, this is a $25,000 expenditure, and that's why I raised the issue of seeing if we could fund it out of this year's reserve fund. Now, I think we said there was about 100,000 left.
You
in the
need
reserve
that for the end of the year, because you get these things that come up if in May and June, to find out the police department is out of money because they had an injured
Not usually
leave.
100,000 without, my question is there any way we can, who's sitting on a $50,000 problem that they're not gonna tell us about until June? That's my real
Usually the
question.
fire department.
Ongoing labor issues with the.
Fire, police?
Okay.
Those bills build up.
Yeah. So I would suggest on this,
I mean, collective bargaining,
Okay,
there
all
will
right.
need to have some.
My only issue was, if we could have done that there and taken it out of reserve, that would have moved the 25,000 off of FY19. The alternative is, all right, we don't want to do that, but if in fact that money was there, we don't use it all up before the end of the fiscal year, that's an extra 25,000 that drops to free cash in FY19 anyway, so we could look at it that way as well. I was just looking for the least painful way to try to do it, so I wasn't advocating one on philosophical grounds.
I would suggest this depends somewhat on how things shake out on the other articles of town meeting and what the free cash is going to be. I mean, I think we would have the discretion to add the amount to the override amount in the election afterwards, Mike, is that correct?
You'd probably need to do it as the separate override.
As a or as a separate, could we do it as a contingent
You've got
article
one,
subject to
one
it?
for ALS, one for Park and Rec, and the stabilization fund, and then the operating budget, supplemental operating budget.
Can we add the state hospital to the operating budget?
No, the operating budget is Article 11. State
Okay.
hospital is a separate warrant article.
Could we amend it and add it to Article 45?
That's the operating budget.
Right,
Article
what I'm saying is,
45.
could you amend Article 45 to add the hospital money to it, such that it would be included in the override amount? The other alternative
You
would be...
could do it if you put it in, say, the selectmen's budget, or you
Yeah.
put it in planning board's budget.
Let's think about that. The other way, I mean, if we end up at an override level where our budgeted free cash amount would be $1,750,000, we could take a little extra out of free cash for this stuff, because it is long-term strategic planning. It would not get us below 1.5, which I think is the absolute minimum. I mean, I don't want to go below 1,750,000, but
Yeah. Well, what you could do is, it would increase the amount of your operating override under Article 11, because when you throw everything together and with your warrant articles, your budget, your estimated revenues, you come up with, in order to keep a 1.75 million free cash, you need this big an override.
Right.
So if you took an additional 100,000 out for the hospital study, you would have to increase the override by 100,000.
I think that's what I would do. That's what I would do, if it
Or
passes.
125,000. So,
Well, let me throw one more curveball in then, because we haven't talked about the townwide master plan, which is another 150,000. And so this is one of the few meetings Mel hasn't been here, and so I'm gonna own this, that he can come after me. To me, 150,000 we're putting for the Parks and Rec facility should go to the townwide master plan. And the reason for that is, as I understand it, the $150,000 for the Parks and Rec facility is going to do soil composition analysis and site assessments to come back with a technical analysis of where a Parks and Rec facility should go, when in fact we have a strategic question of where Parks and Rec should go. That strategic question needs to be answered first. I don't think that any of the 3 sites that I'm aware of would be disqualified from being the site for a Parks and Rec facility. So from my standpoint, rather than throwing the money at a building that's gonna do a technical study that won't do anything, versus throwing the same amount of money at a master plan, which, as one of its questions, should be, give us the strategic answer for where the Parks and Rec facility should go. I think that's where that 150,000 should go. Now, that right now would make that probably show up as yet another potential override item. But I'm actually, in terms of where I'm at on that, that's not just adding more money. I think we're putting that 150,000 in the wrong spot.
Yep, but now the amount for the hospital is 100,000, correct?
Yeah, this is the master plan I'm talking about, the townwide master plan.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay.
And that's not because I'm against a Parks and Rec facility. It's that I don't think we get to a Parks and Rec facility until we answer a strategic question. And all this other stuff is just a way to burn up money. So.
Yeah, that does make sense. I mean, I don't know that we can really reallocate it. In other
No,
words, yeah.
but
That's not
in
right.
terms of
Yeah.
a coherent message here, it's not just let's throw another 150,000 on the override.
Right.
I just think that's misdirected.
Right. Let's put the townwide master plan to one side for a minute on that. Do we need to do anything else tonight at Medfield State Hospital?
You need anything, Steve? The direction sounds good to me, and I
Are we
can't.
on for the meeting?
I can't make the, I'm in LA on the 19th or that first, the meeting that you suggested, but maybe I'm,
We also want to set up the second meeting then with the, so with the 3 committees, so I.
Right.
So did somebody suggest May 29th?
That was on
That's probably,
Yeah, I mean, the 29th, I think, is kind of the drop dead to figure out what we're gonna do if we're gonna have a town meeting in October, so the 29th would make sense.
That's not Memorial Day, is it?
It's the day after Memorial Day. So, I think we can plan on the 29th, and it's open. Right now, we're planning to meet on the 8th and the 22nd in May, so the 29th is open. We can have further, that's I still think in the meantime, we gotta still try to figure out what the implementation committee's gonna do.
yeah,
Kind of what the
yeah,
next-
I kind of had mentally said we should do that after the town meeting, but as soon after the town meeting, we
Yeah.
can start on that, the
Yeah,
better.
and so we'll keep pressing on that, but that's in our court to do, not in your court to do. So it is 10:20. The other minor thing we have to talk about, which is not on our agenda, so we probably should talk about it at a different night, which is our positions on all these various articles.
Yeah, given what you had on the agenda between the ALS and that, I had taken the liberty of moving that to your next Tuesday's meeting.
Which we now are having next Tuesday's meeting, apparently.
I thought we were having next
Okay,
Tuesday's meeting.
all right. No, I figured we would anyway.
I was looking forward to Thursday's meeting this week, but we're not doing that.
That was last Thursday. That threw me off all weekend.
You already have a meeting on
Tomorrow
Thursday.
night.
I do.
Right. All right, so next
It's the
Tuesday.
afternoon, though. I can-
Yeah, no, I think we as much as I don't want to, I think we have to meet next Tuesday to go over, some final things.
You have to,
You don't want to.
yes.
I wanna give you the night off.
You have to vote on the articles.
You actually have
Yeah,
to
that's
get
what
into
we were
the
talking about.
motions
Yeah.
themselves on
Next
these
Tuesday.
articles.
Yeah,
Yeah, so next Tuesday,
but I think we should limit it to our discussion to be,
articles.
to the articles to get that.
Budgets
Mike and I are
Yeah.
wrestling with them, but ultimately there's gonna be some policy decisions.
Okay, let's do that next Tuesday. That's good, otherwise I'd have to go to
Yeah.
a.
The only other,
For my high school alma mater in Boston, so this is great. Gets me out of that.
yeah, you only have one other minor, appointment next Tuesday. The police chief needs an appointment, for, a new recruit for the police department, so that's the only other thing.
So do you want to just finish the financial policies? I only had
Sure.
a couple more things, just so we can cross that off. I got through comment 7, I think that was done.
Yep.
Comment 8, and so, in terms of the permanent planning and building committee, I think it means it's permanent versus ad hoc. As opposed to permanent planning, it's
I think that's,
The alternative to an
I
ad
think
hoc
that's,
committee.
I think that's the name in the charter.
That's the
yeah.
name of the bylaw,
Charter, yeah.
permanent
It's gonna be
planning.
in the
and building.
bylaw too.
Yeah.
once it's
Just
adopted.
read the title, permanent planning. Permanent building, permanent planning.
It's basically
It's
a
a permanent
standing
committee.
committee.
If
It's
it
a
had been
standing
permanent building planning committee, it would have made sense to me. Permanent planning building committee didn't make any sense to me.
I think it's a permanent committee that deals with
I
planning and
won't
building.
fight tradition in Medfield.
Yeah.
That's what we've called it for all these years.
That's what
As
everybody.
long as we keep the tree measurer and the fence walker, I can deal with this.
That would be the field and fence
Colin
viewer.
Measure
Right.
of coal and hay.
Right.
Oh, coal?
Um,
All right.
all right.
You haven't walked the boundaries recently.
So, on comment 9, so I agree with you.
Oh, can I back you up on that? On
sorry.
8? The only question was, so the question I had is, do we want to roll all building investments in this plan to include requested expansions? And is the answer yes?
I think the answer is yes. I think we want to have everything in the plan. I think as to 9, obviously not everything in the plan will ultimately be funded out of the stabilization fund.
Okay.
Because,
Okay.
and I think, for example, the Dale Street feasibility is an example of this. I mean, a lot of times there's not going to be a clear, bright line between a new building versus refurbishing versus maintenance, right? 'Cause I think one of the decisions we'll be making, which we're technically making under the Dale Street feasibility study, is do we build a new building, do we refurbish, what do we do? And so, I kind of thought we could deal with comment 9 just by saying, either certain expenses or some expenses, because there's still going to be financial planning periodically, right, throughout the
Right.
process. And that that'll just have to be defined as we develop the
yeah.
financial implementation over time. We just can't do prospectively the full range of,
Well, so the issue that I had here was, I was not trying to preclude something like the feasibility planning for Dale Street. So the upfront
Right.
Effectively, I'm not trying to preclude anything that would normally only qualify for short-term financing if you were gonna bond it. But I was trying to make it clear the stabilization fund isn't the fund that accrues the construction costs for a new building. That was all. So I don't know if we do that in terms of the financing limits or the funding limits. That was the pieces I read this. So it sounds like we're putting all our building funds through the stabilization fund.
Right, no, that's not the intention, no.
Okay. Okay.
So, maybe we say some expenses included.
Yeah. Yeah, it was like if it's, the expenses for the upfront building planning activities, that's fine.
And you could also get to a point, for example, let's say you're 5 or 8 years in, you've got a big chunk of a project, and interest rates are really low.
Right.
You may conclude, you know what, we're gonna do this through debt exclusion.
Right.
And save this, for something else in the future.
Yep.
All right, so
Okay.
I think
Got
we're
it.
okay with that, and I didn't have any changes. The only reason I included the created by the annual town meeting is that kind of how we refer to funds in different town documents, just for record keeping purposes. As a definitional thing, not so much as, and if we amended the fund, it would be as amended by a future town meeting. That's the only reason I included that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't care, I found it superfluous, and I found this whole document then is anchored to whether or not the article passes at
No,
this
that's a
year's
good
town
point.
meeting.
I mean, this part
If
of
it
it
doesn't
certainly-
pass at this year's town meeting, I still think this is a good thing for us to do, so.
No, and then obviously that part of it would come out, right, that part would have changed. Yep, fine with that deletion.
In the 3 years, we'll appropriate that money. And build a new addition, which was not the intent.
Still another construction,
Yeah.
Think about it, yeah.
so that's just a wording issue.
So do you have a suggestion on that? Because I agree with the point.
Yeah, if you want, right off the top of my head, if I had one, I would have put it in there. I could come up with one, so if you want, I can reword, I can come up with a reword.
Accumulate for use according to the 20-year capital plan and as specifically appropriated as part of the 5-year capital budget.
I think it's really the word construction, but use expenses related
Design.
to preparation for.
Design, maintenance, maybe just design and implementation of capital building and maintenance projects. And just take out construction
Yeah.
entirely.
Yeah,
That might solve the problem.
I think it would.
Right.
Yeah, that works.
And then,
That was question, comment 11, my comment 11. So it's the stabilization fund will be utilized for expenses, the paragraph at the top of that page,
Yeah, that isn't the intent of it, I don't think.
where we were.
That's not the intent of it, this the stabilization fund?
What's not the intent?
Which is that the municipal stabilization fund, or is that the general fund stabilization fund?
It's I assume it's municipal.
capital.
Or whatever, the capital.
I think we call it the capital.
Yeah.
So it's not the basic
Okay.
one.
But
That's a good point.
it's not the intent of that to be used to construct.
Yeah, we're taking out construction.
Yeah, that was
Taking
my
out
reaction
construction,
was,
okay,
because it
yeah.
had construction, it sounds like.
We're
yeah,
deleting
So we're getting rid of
construction.
that. And then it's okay, related to the design and implementation of capital building and maintenance projects. That's
And
good.
so then my only other was on the reserves on the last page, so with the 7.5%. I mean, I think I'd still like to keep the target where it is.
That's, I think I was just asking a question there.
Yeah, I think, because I think the import of the reserves projection is if we want to get to it, putting it in reserves. But I thought in going through the exercise, I was pleasantly surprised that it was not as much of a
Yeah,
course correction as
So,
necessary.
yeah, so the reason now I remember why I did it. You sent out that reserves projection?
Yeah.
And it already has us falling below the 7.5%.
Oh,
So
I
that
know.
was all,
Oh, I
so
know.
as long as we know that, we're
Yes.
saying, no, we want to prevent
So
that,
the
then that's
reserves
fine.
projection is just assuming we don't change anything.
Okay.
Assuming we
That
just stick
that
with
was
our-
why I asked the
Yes,
question.
no, that's
Okay.
kind of what
Yeah.
would
Got
happen
it, okay.
if we don't do this.
So, scratch
Yeah,
You
yeah.
do,
No, that
scratch
was
comment
it.
12 if you didn't have it.
So total annual expenditures, I only picked that line because that's the line that Mike uses for his bottom line in
So-
the warrant sheets.
So it's a semantic comment, and what I was getting at is when we talk about total, I didn't know what total annual expenditures meant. So I had this is in that, just above the OPEB section there. I don't care, it was just the wording. I said, we're trying to maintain a free cash balance in the proposed budget for the upcoming fiscal year equal to at least 2.5% of its total annual expenditures approved at a recent town meeting. So it was like, well, the budget gets approved at the recent town meeting, the expenditures are what you spend. It seemed to me it should be the budget that's the anchor.
Total annual expenditures is a term used by the assessors in setting the tax rate.
So does
They
it
have
mean
total
budget?
revenues and total expenditures.
So it does mean budget allocation.
It means budgets, special warrant articles, cherry sheet assessments, overlay account.
Okay, if that's the right word,
No
now I
deficits,
understand
no
what that word
deficit.
means. I was thinking
It's-
it was talking about what we actually spent, but you're
No,
saying, no, it's
no.
what we're actually allocating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it means what I thought I was changing it to mean when I put the word in. That's fine.
So we can go back to
Okay.
what it says.
So we can go
Yeah,
back to what it
I can see
says.
where you would have
Say
that
for the
confusion.
current
yeah.
fiscal year. I think that's fine. And then everything else I'm fine with. Pete, you okay with?
Yep.
All right, great.
Okay.
So
Good.
I'll get these comments accepted and then sent over to the school committee folks
Okay.
for their review. And obviously, as to the OPEB point, I think it's a fair point. You know, this is kind of the goal to move in that direction. I think personally, kind of the way the ALS committee has done cost assessment for personnel should start to find its way into everything else we do.
Yeah, as a policy, you know, from the funding standpoint, I'm happy with whatever we put there, because if it gets us in trouble at some point, you know, we're gonna quit.
Change
and
the
we'll change
policy,
it, but,
yes,
if I were just stepping back, after having gone through the drill with the paramedics, and recognizing you're picking up 5,000, you know, actuary's estimate is 5,000 a year, I could see having a policy that says our OPEB will increase by $5,000 for each new hire that the town hires. So that basically, what we'd be doing is we've been putting the 400,000 in. From here forward, every new hire, we're actually funding the OPEB thing on those new hires by increasing that amount. Now, at some point, you would, you know, the longstanding employees would go away, you'd be retiring enough that suddenly your gap would close, and then you could do something with that 400,000. But that basic discipline of, we contribute 5,000 a year to OPEB for every new hire we have. You might have some years that you'd go up more than 25,000 a year,
Well,
but
there's-
you might
there's-
not know that.
There's two problems with that. One is, how do you afford that, given all the other pressures for spending money? And the second part is, only about 50% of our employees actually take the health insurance. So you'd be putting money away for employees who probably will never take the insurance.
Well, so,
That's
first comment, to the extent that the actuary's estimate is accurate, that's the real obligation this town has. So it's not a question of how are you gonna spend money there. It's like, we are committing money there. It's just we're committing money down the road. As that number went up, and as the calculation game changes, at some point, we would discover that our obligation is starting to close with where it needs to be, and then you don't have to just keep doing that. But that's the number the actuaries gave us as what the real impact on long-term financial obligations of the town is.
But if our revenues are growing 2 to 3% a year and our expenditures are going up 9%, how do you pay for it?
Well, I think you don't hire as many new people. I mean, the short answer is if revenues go up at one rate, I mean, this, I think, is one of the crossroads we're at right now, is do we live within a Prop 2.5 environment, or do we throw that out and just say we spend whatever we do? I think we are getting to a crunch point where we have to we have to make those decisions. This isn't the place, like, this one's not the place I would do it, because you can pretend you don't have long-term obligations. That's what's gotten us into this hole in the first place. And so this isn't, by hiring someone, you've incurred the cost. It was the hiring decision that brought that obligation in. It wasn't the fact that, are we gonna put the $5,000 in? It's like, it's there once you hire the person. To the extent you believe in the estimate we got.
It was interesting. I was watching a television show from Providence, one of these Sunday morning political things, and they had the mayor of Providence and one of the heads of the Republican Party down there. And two of the points they made, I said, gee, they could have been talking about Medfield. One was that the property tax should not be used to fund education. And that's one of the principal problems in Massachusetts. It is a pathetically poor way to fund education. It let business off the hook, and yet business keeps saying, we need trained employees. Well, if they want trained employees, let them contribute to the education of those trained employees to a greater extent than they are. The other thing they said was that we are ignoring our long-term liabilities, and it's going to get us in trouble, and that's true everywhere.
Right.
And I thought, boy, you know, everybody, I guess basically all cities and towns have got the same problem.
Yep.
At least we're struggling with it. We haven't solved it, but at least we're trying.
So Mike, anything we need to know about this wastewater treatment plant enforcement conference?
Yeah, it's, they lowered the percentage of phosphorus in the discharge from the treatment plant by 90%. So it's very difficult to meet. Mo went out with people from the consulting people that are now running the treatment plant and met with DEP representatives in Worcester and explained, you know, we are trying to address it. We are trying to upgrade our SCADA system. We've trying to replace our filter screens and several other things, and they seem to understand. Usually they fine you $25,000 or $50,000. They said that they were going to fine us $13,000, but if we kept under the 0.1 parts per billion, I think it is, they would lower that fine to the minimum of $1,000, which is the minimum they can fine you, which I think is okay. I still don't like the idea of big brother government instead of helping us, threatening us and fining us. But $1,000 is reasonable. I think they responded pretty well overall.
This is, and the standards got tightened up by an order of magnitude here, right? In the memo.
Absolutely, yeah.
We're out of compliance, not because we're getting worse, but because the largest.
And you know, the sad part is we're putting less phosphate in the water than is in the river than's already in the river. The state is forcing us to clean up the river while they're allowing landscapers and homeowners and golf courses to dump phosphorus on their lawns. So why don't they go after the real offenders? If phosphate is a problem in the East Coast, ban the use of phosphate in fertilizers, but they won't do that. So what do? They force the town and the taxpayers to spend money to clean up a problem that's been created by others. But aside from that, I think probably it's a reasonable solution, and I think Mo feels that we can achieve those standards.
Selectmen report, Pete?
There was someone, it was about, someone contacted me about Hazen Road.
Haven Road.
Haven Road, did you guys?
Oh, is that you?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Are you Michael?
I am Michael.
Welcome. Thank you for staying so long. You should have signed in for citizen comment. You could have gone first.
I was trying to know that was the process, so I have
Nobody does. Nobody signs in for citizen comment.
You're the second person to ever citizen comment.
We need the audience, so we don't tell you that.
It's catch-22.
Right.
It's signed in, you could have spoken and been out of here. Now you can't talk at all.
So Mike, why don't you explain the problem then? Because it was something that I was totally unaware of.
You got the mic? Oh, you got the mic.
Anyway, so Mike's at the area, 7 Haven Road, so I came tonight mostly to express my appreciation to the three of you. I sent you all a note individually just expressing our concerns on our streets, and the fact that all three of you got back to me within a day, greatly appreciated, very thoughtful notes back. So I don't know what needs to be discussed in this forum, but I guess I could summarize. I mean, I want to be respectful of your guys' time. I know it's late and you have bigger fish to fry tonight than our concerns, but essentially it's a safety issue. So we live on a dead-end street, cul-de-sac off of a cul-de-sac. Lots of kids live on the street. Obviously it's a street, right? It's not a playground. We have no expectation that the street is our private playground, but kids like to play on the street that they live on. If you go to any dead-end street in town, you'll probably see kids playing street hockey or riding their bikes or rollerblading. And what's different about our street is it abuts to the conservation land. So we get a disproportional amount of traffic on our street relative to the number of people that live on it, because people drive down the street and they park and they walk their dogs. And there's some safety concerns that we have, all the parents on the street have. So I'm really here on behalf of the kids on the street because of the safety concerns. One is, and again, it's, you know, it's unfortunate because I think a lot of the people that have dogs in town are respectful. But unfortunately, there are a few bad that I think are ruining it for everyone else. The first issue we have is just people coming down the street at an unreasonable rate of speed. Just flying down the street as if they're on 27. It's a dead-end street. The second is they park at the dead-end street, and the first thing they do when they get to the end of the dead-end street is they open up their doors, and these big dogs just come charging out, and when dogs see kids, what do? They go running towards the kids. And then the third, which I think is the most disrespectful, is just the poop bags everywhere. I mean, there's poop bags all over the area that people leave behind. I mean, you know, our kids are older now, but when they were younger, you know, we kept plastic bags in our trunk. So if we had to change a dirty diaper, you know, we didn't have the luxury of just throwing the dirty diaper on the ground, right? We put it in a plastic bag and we disposed of it properly. So the fact that people aren't showing that courtesy to the people that live on the street is a concern to us. And probably what was most concerning to us is, so my wife and the other mothers on the street, they now bring traffic cones with them. Just to put on the street to alert drivers that there's kids playing, so when they come flying down the street to walk their dogs, just be aware there's children playing. And someone actually called the cops on the mothers, and confronted the mothers in front of the children about the cones. The policeman that showed up, I don't recall the officer's name, but he was incredibly respectful to my wife and the other mothers, handled it very professionally, and he encouraged us to write the selectmen and the chief of police. So if you guys want to end the meeting on a fun note, my two daughters actually wrote letters to the chief of police. So, you know, proud daddy moment, although I have to, you know, give my gratitude to the teachers in the Medfield public school system that my kids are able to do this. So the 5-year-old, not very articulate, she...
No pressure, but this is going out on YouTube.
Yeah, so
We're gonna watch, so do it right.
So the 5-year-old, that's her, this dog poop. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. So that was her letter to the chief of police.
This could be a first at a Board of Selectmen's meeting in Medfield.
I'll read you what the 8-year-old wrote, because I think it kind of sums it up better than what I wrote. So she wrote, "Dear Chief, me and my sister and our friends like to go down to play in the cul-de-sac. The cul-de-sac has lots of room, but it doesn't help when cars constantly come down. And sometimes when the owners open the car door, the dog runs towards us and the little ones get scared. And to be honest, I used to be afraid of dogs, and the little ones don't know any better, so they run and the dog chases them and knocks them down. And the owner says it's under voice command, but me and my sister are not under voice command, so how is the dog under voice command?" I feel very unhappy about it because one time I almost got run over. I'm 8 and my sister is 5, and some of our friends are 3 or 4 or even 2, and the 2-year-olds get very, very scared of the dog. So there's an issue. I appreciate you guys at least looking into it, and that's our concern.
Right. I appreciate it. I mean, I think this is an enforcement issue. I mean, I think most of the things you're describing aren't permitted. And so I think we got to figure out with the chief how to get the message across to the
Well, there is also an issue on the leash law, which right now permits voice command, and that's something I didn't change for this town meeting because we were focused on something else, but that was something that the committee was wrestling with.
I think one of the problems you have too, I think the word is out that Medfield is an easy place to walk your dog, so you're getting a lot of out-of-towners coming, and they don't care. And I agree with you 1,000% on people, the lazy slobs that won't pick up after their dogs, that think the world of their mothers is going to pick up after them. They ought to be slapped with huge fines, in my opinion. And instead, we were asked to pay $8,000 of taxpayers' money to hire a firm to pick up the dogs. I know it died, but it certainly offended me that I would be asked to pay taxpayer dollars to pick up dog poop because some dog walker is too lazy to pick up after himself or herself.
But the problem is they do initially, they bag it and they don't take the bag with them.
Yeah.
That's even worse.
I think John Thompson said he had a couple of his volunteers, and they picked up something like 6,000 bags at the hospital one afternoon. I drove down this weekend, and just as you're going down toward the Charles River Gateway, I don't know if it's deliberately put there, but I see all these colored plastic bags, and there's like a culvert kind of thing that's small, and they're all collected there. So the good news is they're collected there, but it's like, it's not a rubbish barrel, it's just somebody, yeah.
That's actually a major source of non-point phosphorus pollution.
Mark, the Article 38 that we have, was it 38? The one that we have on dog control, for any of the issues that Mike's talking about, would they, I mean, we have fines that are being introduced, but I'm thinking particularly, it's not just this story, there was a Facebook exchange about people walking on the Hunt property, the Hunt Club property, and there's some guy that comes out of the woods, and the dog comes bounding out of the woods, and apparently is very aggressive with people that are just walking on that property. I'm still appalled at what happened to the captain of the Dover Sherborne girls track team out running behind her own school.
The problem is that the bylaw right now, which predated me, Mike could tell you that original leash law was one, from what I understand, very contentious town meeting.
Believe it or not, it predated me.
But at any rate, that allows voice command in addition to a leash. And that's something the committee's been wrestling with. The Franklin bylaw is just leash, period. You can't take the dog off leash except in the dog park. So that's something for, a committee to wrestle with and bring back. I've just dealt with the most egregious stuff, which frankly, other than the dog actually literally attacking a kid, that would be covered by this, if in fact that's what it was, as opposed to the dog just being overly exuberant, and who's to say. The other thing is the plastic bags, that's a littering issue, and we don't have a tough littering bylaw. So unfortunately, you gotta put these things in place because, as Mike said, people just can't be left to their own devices to do the right thing, unfortunately.
Do we have any kind of a littering bylaw?
I think a loose one, but I don't know offhand. I'd have to look.
What about the pooper scooper bylaw?
Well, that's arguably they're doing with the pooper scooper bylaw, at least the first part. I don't know if it actually says remove and properly dispose of. If that's so, then yes, and they're not doing it, but then that becomes an enforcement issue. Who's going to enforce that? And that's been a problem since it's been on the books. I'm willing to guess that there hasn't been one single case of an infraction of that bylaw since it was put on the books.
You also have professional dog walkers that are a big problem up at the hospital too. You guys,
Yeah,
I've seen them pull up, take 6 dogs off everything else. I mean, it's just totally unacceptable. I have a big dog, he's on a leash, she's on a leash. I know John Thompson was struggling with trying to, his maintenance people have had all kinds of problems up there, running over the bags, with the lawn mowers and everything else. I know Wheelock Schools had some problems with them. I heard some complaints from some.
And the issue was raised one night, and somebody said, well, what about the horses? They leave bigger droppings than the dogs.
Well, of course, horses are vegetarians, so it's not quite as obnoxious. But,
Yes.
Till you step in it.
Well, it's only to slightly have to walk behind them in the parade, so.
I'll just say one last thing. I know it's like that. So where the exuberance becomes a safety issue is when you have a big dog exciting and charging a child, and the child doesn't understand what's happening.
Right.
They get knocked off. I mean, we've had incidents where kids have been knocked off their bikes because the dogs get excited, and the child doesn't understand what's happening, and their first reaction may be to kick, or maybe the bike falls on the dog the wrong way, and suddenly the dog perceives that as a threat, and now you have a biting incident. So
You'd have to, the starting point has to be the bylaw, it'd have to be the public will to tighten up the bylaw and not allow voice command, strictly leash and period.
Does that even apply, can somebody who has their dog under voice control, can they walk down the main street on the sidewalk without having the dog on a leash?
The way it's worded,
Yeah.
right, yes.
Because a simple answer for some of this from a regulatory standpoint is to sit there and say, if you're on a highway, on a public byway, in public place, the dog's on a leash. If you want to go out, take your dog out in the woods, like or in a field and run, that's a little different. But a dog that gets out of a car and instead of heading into the conservation land, goes across the road and chases, that would be a clear violation.
The only way it's manageable is to basically say leash all the time, except perhaps if you had a dog park or some area for recreation that you wanted to let them off and under voice command under those circumstances, but otherwise it becomes impossible to.
But to Gus's point, you could designate some of those.
You could.
Conservation land.
And that's what they were wrestling, well, they, again, they don't want dogs defecating out there, because that's ironically, when I proposed the Pooper Scooper bylaw in the first place, there was all kinds of opposition. The selectmen were against it, the warrant committee was against it, there was a motion to dismiss. And when somebody made the motion at town meeting, some guy jumped up and he said, no, I live in a subdivision, I'm sick and tired of the dogs crapping on that median green strip between the sidewalk and the street. And it was like a popular uprising that resulted in it passing.
Well, the other problem too was when they had, I think it was Giardia it's called, when the kids were playing football and they were getting Giardia from the dog feces.
Oh, there's absolutely
that's a
disease,
problem.
worms, all kinds of stuff that gets in there.
I think one of the things is, it's the big problem, as Mark alluded to, is enforcement. But I think one of the things that might help is the old cell phone cameras. I think if you film people in the action and then, get a license plate number or something, if you see them leaving a bag down, or if you see the dog running after a kid, and you pull out that cell phone and film it, and then go to the police station and say, here's the evidence, what are you gonna do about it?
Okay. So we have some photos, not video, but we have some photos, so we'll start.
I would suggest you probably want to meet, in other words, we have some tools on the books right now in form of bylaws. They're not perfect, but there are some tools there that simply aren't being enforced. So maybe you want to have a meeting with the police chief and hear your concerns with him, and he's a very receptive person when it comes to that.
Okay.
You've already conveyed the concern to Chief Meany?
Yes, we have.
So, and have you come back? I'm partly thinking, forget the dogs for a minute, thinking about the traffic on the street. If it's kind of hard to pick up a lot of speed on a cul-de-sac, especially a cul-de-sac off a cul-de-sac, but has he had any discussions about putting signs up for children at play or any of that kind of stuff?
So his response was that they sent the patrol car. And they did that for about 2 weeks. We saw the patrol car come down at the peak times. Typically, it's in the morning right before work, there's a huge surge of people. And then usually right after work, there's a huge surge of people. Then we get the professional dog walkers intermittently throughout the day. They sent the patrol car a couple times for about 2 weeks, and then that kind of trailed off. So we'll re-engage him now that I've spoken to you guys and see what he says.
The Municipal Modernization Act did provide municipal authority to create safety zones, which are very low speed zones too, so.
I thought the chief was actually looking at the town for, to give us some guidance as to where we should lower the speed limit, because we can lower the speed limit to 25 miles an hour in all
Right,
sorts of places.
you don't have to, it doesn't go through that mechanism where it's 90% of the.
80%, I think it is.
Right, whatever.
But, so up where I am on Hospital Road, coming into where the 40 mile an hour speed limit change is after you've gone past a quarter of a mile of residential area. It should be way out by the,
Didn't we talk about
on the
that
other side of the Larkins.
months ago?
Well, I thought the chief was actually gonna look at the town and come up with a plan, but I haven't heard anything back from him about it.
I thought that zone in particular was gonna get moved up, because the light that catches you, the speed zone, changes right at the corner, and then you're caught by the machine, but it's like you're coming off that 40 mile an hour zone.
31 miles.
And then and it's like, there's almost, then that almost is counterproductive, because it's like, oh yeah? You didn't tell me till I came around the corner. As soon as it hit me in the face with this thing, and it's kind of like, it doesn't promote cooperation.
Have you gotten a ticket there again?
I have not. I've occasionally looked at that sign. You're so stupid. I don't even my foot on the accelerator, and you're telling me where it's.
You just gotta be sign.
Now, how many cars do you usually, is it like 1 or 2 or 4 or 5 or?
There's usually 4 to 6 parked at the end of the day.
4 to 6 cars.
And it's a revolving door, right, because they're there for 10, 15 minutes. Like, one car leaves, and the next one's like right there. And we've got pictures of the cul-de-sac, looks like, you know, a shopping center with the number of cars.
And where are they actually walking the dogs?
The home plus lines.
It's up
Kind of the back
Wheelock.
way into Wheelock.
Well, that's a back field, we own a field that we
own-
bought from Mr.
We own
Holmquist.
probably a couple of 100 acres back there.
It used to be that the boys would all do airsoft battles over there, and they weren't dogs so much as it was all.
I mean, you know, we could make it a no parking zone, and then that would force them to drive over and park at Wheelock, where there's an actual parking lot.
Yeah, the
I'd
only,
appreciate it.
yeah, the only trouble with that is somebody has a party and the neighbor calls and says, I don't want, you know, they're parking illegally, come down and ticket them, and you're just having a party with your
And we don't
relatives.
probably
or
have any
something.
parking tickets in Medfield, too.
But the other piece of that is if we have conservation land in town, which was intended to be for the recreation of people, and then you don't let people park anywhere where they access it, that you have to be thoughtful about that. There may be a way to stop some of the parking, but provide parking in a better place that's close, that's still, otherwise you're blocking off access.
Maybe instead of a patrol car, they could send some with a radar gun and take it out people on the way out.
I often say with all the conservation land, maybe conservation should ban dog walking if people don't behave responsibly. And then open it up, and if people start the same thing, shut it down again. You know, if they won't behave,
State, you
Yeah.
can't go on state land, you can't walk your dog on the beach or whatever,
Yeah.
you can without a leash, but the law says, you know.
yeah,
They restrict it quite severely,
Yeah, everywhere. I
DCR.
mean, the DCR for the hospital property that's still, you know, going to go to them
Yeah.
when they ultimately pass over the restoration area, they have a requirement, no more than 2 dogs per
Yeah.
person.
I think the best enforcement mechanism is other dog owners, because they will go after, if they know they're gonna lose the privilege of walking their dogs on conservation land, they will go after other dog owners who they see leaving the bags or, you know, running off leash.
The problem with the hospital is that there are a lot of women in the mornings and everything else who walk their dogs, and there are several men who are somewhat intimidating, who do not take criticism from the women that are walking their dogs and expressing concern about these other dogs. And they're intimidated.
Whip
That's
out,
been expressed at one of the
they ought to
times.
whip out their cell phone and photograph him and report it to the police that they, and when write down the remarks that he's made to them.
Yeah, I'm not saying that's not gonna work, but again, that takes a certain amount of courage as well. I mean, because now you're flaunting in somebody's face as you're taking their picture. So the women have expressed reluctance
Yeah.
to actively confront, and a couple of them have been threatened, so I mean.
So this is part of a bigger issue, but
It is a big issue.
but there are parts of it that perhaps can be addressed.
I think this bylaw is a good first step. I think you need to really look at something else, you know, next year, assuming you get this through in one night.
No, I understand, this bylaw this year does nothing to change any of that.
I understand.
It is what it is.
But
But that was something that the committee that was working on the bylaw was,
you're testing the water though, I mean, in terms of being able to
Right.
get something passed.
true.
I mean, Mark, the bylaw does have issues around, or it does have provisions to fine obnoxious dogs. And I'm sitting there thinking, if there were a complaint, you know, if you have a dog, however friendly you started off, it's knocking down little 2-year-old kids.
I think it's worded in terms of chasing, if it's chasing.
Yeah, well, that would be what it's doing, and what I'm getting at is if a complaint, yeah, it's one thing to say, just call the police and say, I got a problem, but the question is whether that article actually gives you leverage on someone. And if it gives you leverage on someone to say, you know, if somebody owns a dog and they come by my house and their dog gives me a hard time, and I ask them who they are, and they choose not to tell me, I can guarantee you if I can get their license plate, I absolutely will go to the police. Because this is someone who is basically not taking responsibility for their dog and then refusing to identify who they are. That, to me, would constitute an absolutely valid complaint. At the very least, that would merit a fine and possibly could merit formal restrictions on.
So it's
on
to
where the
bite,
dog goes.
physically injure, assault, or threaten any person. So a dog on top of you barking or
Right.
whatever.
How do we
being-
define assault?
Well, threaten, if you're a 2-year-old kid, I think it's a 2-year-old that defines threatening. If the dog is, literally, it's a physical event where the dog is chasing that kid. That's-
Because at least for humans, assault does not require touching, need to be touched.
Right.
So,
You've got chase, motorist, bicycle, or pedestrian on any public.
Yeah, that's a separate provision. You got that too, so you got a little bit of help. But the short answer is, keep the dog were on a leash, the opportunity would never arise.
But where you are, where the dog's not on the leash, what I'm saying is that when someone knows that somebody who lives there is upset about how they're handling their dog, and they stop them and say, "Who are you?" and they know that they've got the license plate, it's amazing how people either find a different place to walk their dog, or they figure out how to abide by the rules. And so, you know, maybe the first time you don't even have to file a complaint, as long as they know exactly what you're doing. If you're, you'd be up for that, right? Yeah, I thought you would.
Gus, any selectmen report?
No, actually, the one thing I was gonna bring up was this, so it's only been a few days and, nothing beyond that. I already talked about the ALS, briefings, so.
Nothing from me either. Anything else, Mike, that we need to cover for next Tuesday?
Just for your information, Maureen Anderson was in this week and just released the commitment, the water commitment. and sewer
Oh, it's that
commitment
one,
for the
okay.
So the total commitment, and this is the smaller reading period because it covers the winter, it's November to April, I guess.
Nobody takes
Or
showers.
October to April. So it's 1 million, just under 1,300,000 for both water and sewer. And they're actually fairly close to each other.
Thank you.
Take care. Yeah. Okay, so that's one. Chris and the Personnel Board have been interviewing candidates for building inspector. And John Knapp has agreed to help out with that process. And what have you interviewed, 3 so far?
3 so far.
Okay. We did get a ticket from the Board of Health of the town of Millbury for not having our trash hauling trucks registered with the Board of Health. So I talked to the town administrator today, and he said they issued 500 tickets to haulers up there.
And they were able to avoid an override.
So I said to him, if only we could do that with Cheska trucks. That would solve our override problem.
You didn't tell them we're gonna send our dog walkers to Millbury?
Just the bags. We send our trash there. I don't begrudge them that at all.
Yeah, that's fair.
So town council is researching it. It sounded like their regulations were for private haulers, not for municipalities, so we're gonna look into it and see if we can get that, but
What was how much was the ticket?
$200. Now, they didn't enforce the tickets. What they're trying to do is, he told me they've been issuing them by firm only. What they decided to do was to do it by hauler. And he said they, for example, they had one hauler came in that had 30 trucks. So they licensed each one separately, and I think each one was $100. So they get, $3,000 for, but he said before they just licensed them by firm, so they would only get one license, so.
I did also send out the agreement to our friends on Rockwood Lane.
Oh, excellent, thank you. All right. Anything else? Motion to adjourn?
I move, we adjourn.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
And we'll try to get the motions out to you so early.